Welcome to Moonlight Myths, where soothing stories guide you gently into sleep. I'm so glad you're here. If you enjoy this journey, I'd love for you to like and subscribe so we can share many more peaceful nights together. Now settle in, let yourself relax, and allow the story to carry you into the sweetest dreams. Close your eyes and let yourself drift down through layers of time, through centuries of stories told and retold, until we reach the ancient world, where the sea held mysteries we are only beginning to remember. Today, when we hear the word mermaid, we often think of the same creature when we hear siren. They blur together in our modern imagination. Beautiful beings with fish tails, singing from rocks, luring sailors with enchanted voices. We use the names almost interchangeably, as if they were always one and the same. But this was not always so. In the beginning, in the oldest stories, mermaids and sirens were entirely different beings. They lived in different waters. They came from different myths. They meant different things to the people who whispered their names. Let yourself sink deeper now, into that ancient world, where the Mediterranean glitters under an endless sun, and Greek sailors navigate by stars they know as gods. The sirens, the original sirens, were not creatures of the sea at all, not in the way we imagine them now. They belonged to the air as much as to the shore. In the oldest Greek tales, sirens were depicted with the bodies of birds, fierce and strange, with the faces of women and the wings and talons of raptors. They perched on cliffs overlooking the sea, on rocky islands where ships would pass, and from those high places they sang. Their song was irresistible, not because it promised love or beauty, but because it promised knowledge. The sirens sang of everything that had ever happened, everything that was happening in the world at that very moment. They offered wisdom, the kind of complete understanding that mortal minds could never possess on their own. And so sailors, hearing that song drifting across the water, would steer toward the rocks. Not out of enchantment in the romantic sense, but out of an overwhelming hunger to know, to understand, to possess that divine knowledge. And the sirens would devour them. Breathe slowly now, in and out, as we let that image settle. These were not gentle creatures. They were dangerous, yes, but in a way that spoke to something deep in the human spirit. The danger of curiosity. The peril of seeking knowledge that was never meant for mortal minds. Now, let us turn to the mermaids. The mermaids of ancient times were different beings entirely. While sirens belonged to Greek mythology, mermaids appeared in the folklore of many cultures, from Assyria to Syria, from Celtic shores to Norse fjords. Unlike the bird-bodied sirens, mermaids were always depicted with fish tails, beings who belonged completely to the water. In some of the oldest stories, mermaids were not inherently dangerous. They were mysterious, otherworldly, neither wholly good nor wholly evil. They existed in that liminal space, between sea and air, between human and animal, between the known world and the depths that no human eye had seen. Some tales painted them as protective spirits, guardians of drowned sailors, who would guide lost souls to peaceful rest beneath the waves. Other stories warned that mermaids were omens, appearing before storms, their presence a sign that the sea was about to claim lives. But they were not the sirens. They did not perch on rocks and sing of forbidden knowledge. They did not lure sailors to their doom with promises of understanding all the world's secrets. Let the distinction settle into your mind now, gently, like sediment drifting down through dark water. Sirens, with their bird bodies and their irresistible songs of knowledge, creatures of air and cliff and the space between sky and sea. Mermaids, with their fish tails and their deep connection to the ocean itself, creatures of water and mystery and the hidden places far below the surface. Two different beings, two different myths, two different meanings. The ancient Greeks knew this. When Homer wrote of Odysseus and his crew sailing past the Sirens' island, he described birdwomen on the shore. When medieval monks illuminated manuscripts with images of sirens, they often drew them with wings and talons. The distinction was clear. And yet, somewhere in the centuries that followed, the two began to merge. Perhaps it was because both were associated with the sea, even if in different ways. Perhaps it was because both sang, though their songs meant different things. Perhaps it was simply that as cultures blended and stories traveled, the details became confused, simplified, reshaped into something easier to remember. By the time we reached the Renaissance, artists were already beginning to paint sirens with fish tails instead of bird bodies. The word siren was increasingly used to describe any beautiful woman who lured men to danger with her voice. The distinction that the ancient world understood so clearly began to fade like morning mist over the water. But here in this moment, as you rest and let your mind wander through these ancient stories, we can remember. We can hold both images in our minds. The siren on her cliff, wings folded, singing of all the world's knowledge. The mermaid in her depths, tail glimmering, singing songs of the sea itself. They were not the same. And perhaps there is something important in remembering that difference. Perhaps it tells us something about how stories change, how they blend and merge and transform over time, how each generation reshapes the myths it inherits, adding new meanings, forgetting old distinctions. The ancient world was very far from us now. Those Greek sailors who feared the siren song are dust. The cultures that first whispered of mermaids have long since faded into history. But the stories remain. Changed, yes. Blurred, certainly. But still powerful. Still alive in our imagination. As you drift toward sleep, let yourself hold this knowledge gently. Mermaids and sirens, once distinct, now intertwined in our collective memory. Neither version is wrong. The ancient understanding and the modern blending, both are part of how these creatures live in human consciousness. Perhaps that is the nature of myths themselves. They are not fixed. They flow like water, changing shape while somehow remaining themselves. The siren sings on her cliff. The mermaid swims in the depths. And we, drifting between waking and sleep, can honor both versions of the story. Let your breathing slow, deep and easy, as we prepare to dive deeper still into the waters of myth and memory. The ancient world had its understanding. We have ours. And the creatures themselves, whether sirens or mermaids, continue to sing in the space. Close your eyes and let yourself drift, down through layers of time, through centuries of stories told and retold, until we reach the ancient world, where the sea held mysteries we are only beginning to remember. Today, when we hear the word mermaid, we often think of the same creature when we hear siren. They blur together in our modern imagination. Beautiful beings with fish tails, singing from rocks, luring sailors with enchanted voices. We use the names almost interchangeably, as if they were always one and the same. But this was not always so. In the beginning, in the oldest stories, mermaids and sirens were entirely different beings. They lived in different waters. They came from different myths. They meant different things to the people who whispered their names. Let yourself sink deeper now, into that ancient world, where the Mediterranean glitters under an endless sun, and Greek sailors navigate by stars they know as gods. The sirens, the original sirens, were not creatures of the sea at all, not in the way we imagine them now. They belonged to the air as much as to the shore. In the oldest Greek tales, sirens were depicted with the bodies of birds, fierce and strange, with the faces of women and the wings and talons of raptors. They perched on cliffs overlooking the sea, on rocky islands where ships would pass, and from those high places they sang. Their song was irresistible, not because it promised love or beauty, but because it promised knowledge. The sirens sang of everything that had ever happened, everything that was happening in the world at that very moment. They offered wisdom, the kind of complete understanding that mortal minds could never possess on their own. And so sailors, hearing that song drifting across the water, would steer toward the rocks. Not out of enchantment in the romantic sense, but out of an overwhelming hunger to know, to understand, to possess that divine knowledge. And the sirens would devour them. Breathe slowly now, in and out, as we let that image settle. These were not gentle creatures. They were dangerous, yes, but in a way that spoke to something deep in the human spirit. The danger of curiosity. The peril of seeking knowledge that was never meant for mortal minds. Now, let us turn to the mermaids. The mermaids of ancient times were different beings entirely. While sirens belonged to Greek mythology, mermaids appeared in the folklore of many cultures, from Assyria to Syria, from Celtic shores to Norse fjords. Unlike the bird-bodied sirens, mermaids were always depicted with fish tails, beings who belonged completely to the water. In some of the oldest stories, mermaids were not inherently dangerous. They were mysterious, otherworldly, neither wholly good nor wholly evil. They existed in that liminal space, between sea and air, between human and animal, between the known world and the depths that no human eye had seen. Some tales painted them as protective spirits, guardians of drowned sailors, who would guide lost souls to peaceful rest beneath the waves. Other stories warned that mermaids were omens, appearing before storms, their presence a sign that the sea was about to claim lives. But they were not the sirens. They did not perch on rocks and sing of forbidden knowledge. They did not lure sailors to their doom with promises of understanding all the world's secrets. Let the distinction settle into your mind now, gently, like sediment drifting down through dark water. Sirens, with their bird bodies and their irresistible songs of knowledge, creatures of air and cliff and the space between sky and sea. Mermaids, with their fish tails and their deep connection to the ocean itself, creatures of water and mystery and the hidden places far below the surface. Two different beings, two different myths, two different meanings. The ancient Greeks knew this. When Homer wrote of Odysseus and his crew sailing past the Sirens' island, he described birdwomen on the shore. When medieval monks illuminated manuscripts with images of sirens, they often drew them with wings and talons. The distinction was clear. And yet, somewhere in the centuries that followed, the two began to merge. Perhaps it was because both were associated with the sea, even if in different ways. Perhaps it was because both sang, though their songs meant different things. Perhaps it was simply that as cultures blended and stories traveled, the details became confused, simplified, reshaped into something easier to remember. By the time we reached the Renaissance, artists were already beginning to paint sirens with fish tails instead of bird bodies. The word siren was increasingly used to describe any beautiful woman who lured men to danger with her voice. The distinction that the ancient world understood so clearly began to fade like morning mist over the water. But here in this moment, as you rest and let your mind wander through these ancient stories, we can remember. We can hold both images in our minds. The siren on her cliff, wings folded, singing of all the world's knowledge. The mermaid in her depths, tail glimmering, singing songs of the sea itself. They were not the same. And perhaps there is something important in remembering that difference. Perhaps it tells us something about how stories change, how they blend and merge and transform over time, how each generation reshapes the myths it inherits, adding new meanings, forgetting old distinctions. The ancient world was very far from us now. Those Greek sailors who feared the siren's song are dust. The cultures that first whispered of mermaids have long since faded into history. But the stories remain. Changed, yes. Blurred, certainly. But still powerful. Still alive in our imagination. As you drift toward sleep, let yourself hold this knowledge gently. Mermaids and sirens, once distinct, now intertwined in our collective memory. Neither version is wrong. The ancient understanding and the modern blending. Both are part of how these creatures live in human consciousness. Perhaps that is the nature of myths themselves. They are not fixed. They flow like water, changing shape while somehow remaining themselves. The siren sings on her cliff. The mermaid swims in the depths. And we, drifting between waking and sleep, can honor both versions of the story. Let your breathing slow, deep and easy, as we prepare to dive deeper still into the waters of myth and memory. The ancient world had its understanding. We have ours. And the creatures themselves, whether sirens or mermaids, continue to sing in the space between. Rest now. Let the distinction settle into your dreams. Let us journey now, deeper into the world of ancient Greece, where marble temples gleam white against the brilliant blue sky, and the sea is everything. Life, death, mystery. The Greeks understood the sea as a living force, beautiful and treacherous in equal measure. And on the edges of that sea, on rocky islands where the waves crashed and the wind howled, there lived the sirens. Picture them now, as the ancient Greeks did, not as mermaids with shimmering tails, but as something stranger, something that belonged to both earth and sky. A woman's head, beautiful, with flowing hair and eyes that held secrets. A woman's torso, the curve of shoulders, the grace of arms. But below, the body transformed. Wings sprouted from their backs, great feathered wings like those of a bird of prey. Their lower bodies were not human at all, but avian, covered in feathers, ending in sharp talons made for gripping stone. Bird women. That is what they were. Creatures caught between human and animal, between the rational and the wild. They perched on their islands, rocky outcroppings that rose from the sea along the most dangerous routes. Places where the currents ran treacherous, where hidden rocks lurked just beneath the surface, ready to tear the hull from any ship that ventured too close. The sirens made their homes in these places of natural danger, and they added to that danger something far more deadly: their song. Breathe deeply now, and imagine you are a sailor on an ancient Greek vessel. You have been at sea for days, perhaps weeks. The sun beats down mercilessly. The work is backbreaking. You know the stories. You know that the sea is full of dangers, both natural and supernatural. You are watchful, careful, and then you hear it. At first, it is distant, a melody carried on the wind. Beautiful, achingly beautiful, unlike any song you have ever heard. It seems to speak directly to something deep inside you, something you did not even know was there. The song grows clearer as your ship sails closer to those rocky islands. And now you can hear words, or perhaps not words exactly, but meanings. The sirens are singing of everything you have ever wanted to know. They sing of your home, of what is happening there right now, while you are far away at sea. They sing of the future, of what will become of you, of your family, of your city. They sing of the gods' secrets, of the mysteries that even the priests do not understand. They are offering you knowledge. Complete knowledge. Perfect understanding of everything that has happened, everything that is happening, everything that will happen. How could you resist? The ancient Greeks understood this as the deepest temptation. Not the temptation of pleasure, not the temptation of comfort or luxury, but the temptation of knowing, of understanding, of possessing the kind of complete wisdom that should belong only to the gods themselves. And so the sailor, despite himself, despite his training and his fear, begins to steer toward the rocks, toward those islands where the sirens perch with their wings folded and their talons gripping stone, toward the source of that irresistible song. The ship strikes the rocks. The hull splinters. The sailor is thrown into the churning water, and the sirens descend. Let that image fade now, like a dream dissolving in the morning light. Settle deeper into comfort, into the safety of this moment, where you are far from any ancient sea. The sirens were more than just dangerous creatures in Greek mythology. They served a purpose in the stories, a specific role that the Greeks understood instinctively. They were tests. When heroes set out on their great journeys, Odysseus sailing home from Troy, Jason and the Argonauts seeking the Golden Fleece, they would inevitably encounter the sirens. These encounters were not random. They were trials. Obstacles placed in the hero's path to test his wisdom, his self-control, his ability to resist temptation. In Homer's Odyssey, Odysseus knows the sirens are waiting. The goddess Circe has warned him. She tells him that no man who hears the siren's song can resist it, but she also tells him how he might survive. He must plug his men's ears with beeswax so they cannot hear. And if he himself wishes to hear the song and live, he must have his men bind him to the mast of his ship so tightly that he cannot break free, no matter how he struggles. Odysseus does this. He hears the siren's song, and it is everything Circe promised. He screams at his men to untie him. He begs. He commands. He fights against the ropes with all his strength. But his men, their ears sealed with wax, row steadily on. They cannot hear their captain's pleas, and they cannot hear the siren's deadly song. And so Odysseus passes the test. He hears the sirens and lives, becoming the only man in all the stories who can make that claim. The sirens, in this way, become symbols. They represent the limits of human wisdom, the danger of curiosity that goes too far, the fatal attraction of forbidden knowledge. Breathe slowly, in and out, as we explore what the sirens meant to the ancient mind. They were associated with death, yes. The bones of sailors littered their islands, bleaching in the sun. But they were associated with a particular kind of death. Death that comes from reaching beyond your proper place. From trying to know what mortals should not know. In Greek thought, there were boundaries. The gods had their realm, humans had theirs. To cross those boundaries, to seek divine knowledge, divine power, divine understanding, was hubris. It was the gravest sin. And it always led to destruction. The sirens embodied this danger. They offered something genuinely valuable. Not a trick, not an illusion. They really did possess complete knowledge. They really could tell you everything you wanted to know. But to accept their offer was to transgress that fundamental boundary. To claim something that was not meant for mortal minds. And so the sailors died. Not because the sirens were cruel, though perhaps they were, but because they had reached for something forbidden. There is something profound in this, even now. something that still resonates as you drift towards sleep. The idea that some knowledge, some understanding, might be dangerous to possess, that there are questions we might be better off not asking, boundaries that exist for a reason. The ancient Greeks, in their wisdom, gave form to this idea. They put wings on it. They gave it a woman's face and a bird's body. They placed it on rocky islands where the unwary would meet their end. The Sirens were temptation incarnate, but not the temptation of obvious pleasures. The subtler, more dangerous temptation of wanting to understand everything, of refusing to accept the limits of human knowledge. Let your mind rest now on those rocky islands, where the Sirens perch in the sun, wings folded, singing their songs of forbidden wisdom. No ships approach anymore. The ancient world has faded. The Mediterranean carries different vessels now, guided by technology the Greeks could never have imagined. But the Sirens remain in our stories, in our imagination, still singing, still dangerous, still representing that eternal human desire to know, and the eternal danger that comes from knowing too much. The hero Odysseus passed their island bound to his mast, screaming to be released. Other sailors were not so clever. Their bones rest on those rocks still, in the world of myth and memory. And the Sirens sing on, their voices carrying across millennia, reminding us that some temptations are all the more dangerous for being genuine. Rest now in this knowledge. Let the song fade to silence. Let the ancient sea grow calm. The test is over. You have listened, and you remain. There is more to the Sirens, layers beneath layers, like descending through dark water into depths where sunlight cannot reach. The ancient Greeks did not tell just one story about the Sirens. They told many. And in some of these tales, whispered in sacred places, recorded in fragments of old texts, there are hints of something deeper. Something that connects the Sirens not just to the sea and its dangers, but to death itself, to the underworld, to the realm of shadows where the spirits of the dead dwell forever. Let yourself sink into this mystery now, breathing slowly, easily, as we explore the darker threads of the Siren myth. Some scholars, studying the oldest texts and images, have suggested that the Sirens were originally spirits of the dead. Psychopomps, perhaps? Creatures that guided souls from the world of the living to the realm of Hades. Or perhaps they were the souls themselves, the dead who could not rest, who lingered in the liminal spaces between life and death. Think of it now, those rocky islands where the Sirens lived. Islands along the sea routes, yes, but also threshold places. Neither fully land nor fully sea. Places between. And the Greeks understood that such places, beaches, shorelines, crossroads, doorways, were where the boundary between worlds grew thin. The Sirens perched there, singing. And what were they singing about? All knowledge. All that has happened. All that is happening. All that will happen. Past, present, and future flowing together in their song. This is the knowledge of the dead. The dead, who have passed beyond time, who see with clarity what the living can only glimpse in fragments. The dead, who know all secrets because they have left behind the confusion and limitation of mortal life. Perhaps the Sirens were offering not just forbidden knowledge, but the knowledge that comes only with death itself. To hear their song completely, to understand it fully, a sailor would have to cross that final threshold, would have to join the dead. And so the shipwreck, the drowning, the white bones on the rocks, these were not just punishments for curiosity. They were transformations. The sailors became what they sought. They gained the knowledge they craved, by dying. Breathe deeply. Let this darker interpretation settle into your awareness like mist settling into a valley. In some ancient Greek art, Sirens appear not on sea cliffs, but in cemeteries. They are carved on tombs. They stand as funeral monuments. Their song becomes a dirge, a lament for the dead, or perhaps a call to the dead, inviting them to cross over. The connection makes a certain strange sense. Birds, after all, were often associated with souls in Greek thought. The soul might leave the body as a bird leaves its nest. And the Sirens, bird women, existed in that same space between human and animal, between body and spirit, between the world we know and the world we can only imagine. They were creatures of transition, of transformation, of the dangerous crossing from one state to another. And they sang. Let us consider now the instruments they played. In the oldest images, vase paintings and sculptures and temple friezes, The sirens are not shown simply opening their mouths to sing. They hold instruments. Lyres, with their strings glinting in the sun. Flutes of reed or bone, raised to their lips. Sometimes even early forms of harps or drums. The Greeks were telling us something with these images. The sirens were musicians. True musicians. Their power came not just from their voices, but from their mastery of music itself. Picture one of them now, perched on her rock, wings folded against her bird's body. She cradles a lyre against her torso, her human torso with its human arms. Her fingers pluck the strings with practiced skill. Each note is perfect, pure. The melody that emerges is not random. It is crafted, composed. A work of art that happens to be deadly. Another siren raises a flute to her lips. The sound is clear and sweet, like water running over stones, like wind through cypress trees, like the voice of grief itself. The music weaves together with her sister's lyre, harmonizing, creating something more than either instrument alone could produce. This is not crude magic. This is art at its highest level. Music so beautiful, so perfectly constructed, that it transcends normal human experience. It touches something primal. Something that exists before language, before thought. In the deep places of the soul where we are still half animal, still creatures of instinct and wordless longing. The Greeks understood the power of music. They knew it could heal or harm, could rouse courage or inspire terror, could calm anger or incite violence. In their myths, musicians had power that rivaled the gods. Orpheus could charm stones and trees and wild beasts with his lyre. The god Apollo himself was a musician, and his music was divine perfection. The sirens possessed this same power. They were, in their way, the equal of Orpheus, the equal of Apollo himself. But they used their gift for death rather than life. Or perhaps they saw no difference. Perhaps in their understanding, their music was a gift. They were offering transformation. Release from the burden of limited mortal understanding. An end to the pain and confusion of human existence. Death, after all, is not always seen as evil. Sometimes it is release. Sometimes it is peace. And the sirens' music promised that peace, even as it led to destruction. Let your breathing slow now, deeper, as you imagine that music drifting across dark water. The lyre sings. The flute answers. The voices of the sirens weave through it all. Wordless now, just pure sound. Pure beauty. Pure danger. A sailor hears it and thinks, this is the most beautiful thing I have ever heard. This is the most beautiful thing I will ever hear. I must go closer. I must hear it completely. Nothing else matters. And perhaps he is right. Perhaps in that moment, hearing the sirens' music, he experiences something that makes the rest of his life seem like shadow. Perhaps the drowning, the death, is worth it for that one moment of perfect beauty, perfect understanding. The Greeks did not answer this question. They left it open, hovering, like the sirens themselves hover between categories. Bird and woman, sea and sky, life and death, art and destruction. The sirens play their instruments on their lonely rocks. The music carries across the water, and sailors, century after century, choose to listen, choose to steer toward the sound, knowing the danger, unable to resist, because the music is real, the beauty is genuine, the offer of transcendence, of crossing over into complete knowledge, complete understanding, is not a trick. It is simply more than a mortal can survive. Rest now, let the music fade, let the image of those bird women with their lyres and flutes dissolve like foam on the shore. They are spirits of the dead, perhaps. Or they are simply themselves, creatures that exist in that liminal space where beauty and death are the same thing, where music is both art and weapon, where knowledge and destruction cannot be separated. The ancient Greeks gave them wings and instruments, placed them on rocks between sea and sky, between life and death, between the mortal world and the shadowy realm below. And there they remain, in our myths, in our dreams, playing their eternal music. Beautiful. Deadly, impossible to forget. Let yourself drift now, past their islands, safely bound like Odysseus, or with your ears sealed like his crew. You have heard the music, in your imagination, and you remain. The song fades behind you. The journey continues. The underworld keeps its secrets, and the sirens play on. Let us turn now from the bird women of Greece, from their rocky islands and their deadly songs, and descend into different waters. Deeper waters, the realm of the mermaids. Breathe slowly, and imagine you are sinking beneath the surface of the sea. The light changes, becomes softer, filtered through the water above. The sounds of the world fade, replaced by the gentle pulse of currents, the distant songs of whales, the whisper of water moving through underwater caves. This is where the mermaids live. Not perched on rocks between sky and sea, but fully immersed in the ocean itself. They are creatures of the depths, creatures of water. Picture them now as the ancient world did. A woman's head, beautiful, with long hair that floats around her like seaweed, like silk. A woman's torso, the curve of breast and waist. And below, where human legs should be, a fish's tail. Powerful, scaled, glinting silver or green or blue in the filtered light. Built for swimming, for diving, for gliding through water as naturally as you move through air. Half woman, half fish. Not half bird like the sirens. These are beings who belong completely to the water. They do not need the air. They do not need the land. The sea is their home, their entire world. And they have been swimming through human imagination for a very, very long time. Let yourself drift back now, further even than ancient Greece, to the cradle of civilization itself, to Assyria, where the great rivers flow and the temples rise toward the heavens. There, thousands of years ago, the people worshipped a goddess named Atargatis. The stories say she was once human, a mortal woman who threw herself into a lake, overcome by shame or grief. The waters took pity on her. They transformed her, gave her the tail of a fish so she could live in their depths forever. She became divine, a goddess of the waters, a protector of fish and fishermen. This may be one of the oldest mermaid stories we have. Atargatis, neither fully human nor fully divine, dwelling in the liminal space between. Her temples stood near water. Her priests and priestesses honored her with rituals that involved sacred pools. She was powerful, revered, and she wore the form that would become so familiar: woman above, fish below. But Atargatis was not alone. All across the ancient world, in cultures that never met, never shared their stories, there appeared tales of water beings with similar forms. In Syria, in Mesopotamia, along the coasts of Africa and India and the Celtic lands, people told of creatures that lived beneath the waves. Some called them different names. Some gave them different attributes. But the form remained strangely consistent. Woman and fish combined. Beings of the water. Why? What is it about this image that captured so many imaginations across so many cultures? Perhaps because water itself is so essential, so mysterious. The ancient peoples lived by water, rivers and lakes and seas. Water gave them life, provided food, transportation, the ability to grow crops and sustain communities. But water was also dangerous. Floods destroyed. Storms killed. The depths hid unknown terrors. It makes sense, then, that they would imagine the water itself as alive, as inhabited by beings who understood its nature, who could control it, or at least navigate it, who could be appealed to, bargained with, honored. The mermaids became the spirits of the water, the personification of the sea itself. Breathe deeply now, and let this understanding settle. The mermaids were not intruders in the sea. They were the sea made manifest. They belonged there absolutely. They made their homes in the depths, in underwater palaces of coral and pearl, if the stories are to be believed, in caves where the water glowed with phosphorescence, in grottos adorned with treasure from sunken ships, in the deep trenches where sunlight never reached and strange creatures dwelled. But they also inhabited lakes, fresh water as well as salt, mountain pools fed by springs, rivers where the current ran swift, any water deep enough to hide them, any water mysterious enough to harbor secrets. And unlike the sirens, unlike those bird women with their single deadly purpose, the mermaids were varied in nature, complex, as varied as humans themselves. Some mermaids, in the old stories, were dangerous. They would drag swimmers down into the depths, capsize boats, cause storms with their anger. They were wild, untamed, as unpredictable as the sea itself. But others were helpful, gentle, They would guide lost sailors to safe harbors, warn of approaching storms, save drowning children and return them to shore. They fell in love with humans, formed bonds, sometimes even left the sea to live on land, though such tales rarely ended well. Let your mind rest on this variety, this moral complexity. The mermaids were not symbols of a single concept like the sirens. They were not tests or obstacles. They were, themselves, individuals. Some kind, some cruel, some indifferent to human affairs. They could be lovers, swimming alongside a ship night after night, calling to a particular sailor, eventually luring him down to live with them forever beneath the waves. Were such sailors drowned? Or did they find happiness in the underwater realm? The stories disagree. They could be rescuers, appearing in the midst of a storm to guide a vessel through treacherous waters, asking nothing in return, vanishing once the danger passed. They could be omens, their appearance before a voyage meaning good fortune or doom, depending on the tale, the culture, the particular mermaid. They could be guides, showing fishermen where the fish were plentiful, leading divers to oyster beds full of pearls, revealing underwater passages through the reef. In the medieval period, artists began to paint and carve mermaids with specific symbols. Almost always, these mermaids held certain objects. A mirror, round and polished, reflecting the mermaid's own face. A comb, often golden, drawn through long flowing hair. These symbols meant something. The mirror suggested vanity, perhaps self-regard. The mermaid gazing at her own beauty. But mirrors also symbolized truth, reflection, self-knowledge. The ability to see clearly. The comb represented grooming, the civilized act of caring for one's appearance. It suggested that mermaids were not simply animals. They had culture. They had habits and rituals. They were persons, not just creatures. And the hair itself, always long, always flowing, always beautiful. Hair that moved with the currents like seaweed. Hair that a sailor might glimpse from a distance and mistake for floating kelp. Hair that could entangle or entice. These images appear again and again. The mermaid with her mirror and comb, sitting on a rock or floating in calm water, lost in the contemplation of her own reflection. Rest now in this gentler image. Let it replace the sharper vision of the sirens on their deadly rocks. The mermaid is not singing to lure sailors to their doom. She is simply existing, living her life in the sea. She may not even notice the ship passing overhead. She is brushing her hair, looking at herself in her mirror, thinking thoughts we cannot know. And this is crucial. This is what separates mermaids from sirens in the oldest understanding. Mermaids were not inherently tied to death. They were not agents of destruction. They were not tests or punishments or symbols of forbidden knowledge. They were simply there, in the water, living their lives. Sometimes interacting with humans, sometimes not. Sometimes helpful, sometimes harmful, often simply indifferent. They were mysteries. Yes. They were magical. Certainly. They were dangerous, potentially. But they were not doom itself. Not death incarnate. Not inevitably fatal. A sailor might encounter a mermaid and survive. Might even thrive. Might find love or treasure or guidance or luck. Or he might find nothing at all. Just a glimpse of something strange and beautiful, vanishing back beneath the waves. The mermaids offered possibility. They offered the full range of what might happen when humans and the supernatural meet. Not a single story, but countless stories. Not a single meaning, but layers of meaning. Let yourself float now in these more varied waters, where mermaids swim through their underwater kingdoms, combing their hair, gazing in their mirrors, singing songs that are not deadly but simply beautiful. Songs of the sea itself. Songs of their own mysterious lives. They are neither good nor evil. They are both and neither. They are the water made flesh, and water can give life or take it, can be gentle or violent, can be crossed or drowned in. The mermaids understood this. They embodied it. And they swim still, through our imaginations, as varied and complex as the seas themselves. Beautiful and strange. Dangerous and kind. Forever just beneath the surface. Time moves forward now, like a slow current carrying us from the ancient world into something new. The Roman Empire crumbles. Christianity spreads across Europe. The old gods fade, but the old stories remain, transformed, reinterpreted, woven into new contexts. And somewhere in this transition, in this great shift of cultures and beliefs, the boundary between sirens and mermaids begins to crack. Breathe slowly. Let yourself drift through centuries, from the classical world into the early Middle Ages. The Mediterranean still glitters under the same sun, but the people who sail it have different beliefs now, different ways of understanding the world. In this new Christian world, scholars and monks labor in scriptoriums, copying old texts, writing new ones, trying to make sense of the pagan past. They encounter the ancient stories, the Greek and Roman myths, and they must decide what to do with them. Are these stories true? False? Dangerous? Instructive? And what of the creatures in these stories? The sirens, for instance. Do they exist? Did they ever exist? What do they mean? Around the 7th or 8th century, we cannot be certain of the exact date, someone compiled a text called the Liber Monstrorum, the Book of Monsters. It was meant to be a catalogue, a reference work describing all the strange and wondrous creatures that existed or were said to exist in the world. The author, unknown to us now, had read the ancient Greek texts, had encountered Homer's sirens, those bird women on their rocky islands. But something happened in the translation, in the interpretation, in the understanding. Let yourself imagine this monk or scholar, sitting in a cold stone room perhaps, with parchment spread before them and a quill in hand. They are writing about sirens. They know the sirens are dangerous sea creatures that sing. They know sailors die because of them. But the specific details, bird bodies, wings, talons, these perhaps seem strange, unlikely, difficult to reconcile with Christian cosmology. And they have also heard other stories. Stories of fish-tailed women in the sea, mermaids, water spirits. Perhaps it seems reasonable to combine them, to simplify, to create a clearer picture. And so this author writes in the Liber Monstrorum that sirens are maidens of the sea, beautiful from the head to the navel, with the bodies of fish below. They live in the water. They sing to sailors. They cause death. Fish-tailed, not bird-bodied. It is a small change, a single decision in a single text. But it is the first crack, the first merging of two distinct beings into one. The distinction that was so clear to the ancient Greeks, bird women versus fish women, begins to blur. Breathe deeply now, and feel the significance of this moment, small as it seems. This is how stories change. Not through grand declarations or official pronouncements, but through quiet mistakes, through misunderstandings, through the gradual shifting of details as stories pass from culture to culture, language to language, century to century. The Liber Monstrorum was not widely read. It was not considered a definitive authority, but it was copied. It was referenced. Other writers encountered it and absorbed its version of the sirens. Sirens with fish tails instead of bird bodies. And slowly, very slowly, the image began to shift. At the same time, the Christian scholars were doing something else with the old myths. They were allegorizing them, turning them into moral lessons, warnings against sin. The ancient Greeks had understood the sirens as symbols of forbidden knowledge, of the danger of curiosity that goes too far. But the Christian writers saw them differently. To them, the sirens represented the temptations of the flesh, the dangers of worldly pleasure, the seductive call of sin itself. In medieval sermons and texts, the sirens became examples, warning signs. A preacher might tell his congregation, just as the sirens lured sailors to their deaths with beautiful songs, so does sin lure the unwary soul to damnation with the promise of pleasure. The story of Odysseus, that clever hero who had himself bound to the mast, became a story about resisting temptation through wisdom and preparation. Odysseus was no longer just a Greek hero. He became a model Christian, someone who knew his own weakness and took steps to protect himself from sin. Let this interpretation settle into your awareness now, like sediment drifting down through dark water. The sirens are changing, losing their specific identity as beings from Greek mythology, becoming instead symbols, allegories, representations of abstract concepts. They are no longer creatures with their own stories, their own natures, their own purposes. They are becoming tools, teaching aids, ways to illustrate moral points. This is what happens when living myths encounter dogmatic religion. The myths are not destroyed, Not exactly. They are tamed, domesticated, made to serve new purposes. The Sirens, who once offered forbidden knowledge, who were connected to the underworld and the spirits of the dead, who sang with lyres and flutes on their rocky islands. These Sirens are simplified, reduced, made into simple warnings against lust and worldly pleasure. And in this simplification, in this allegorization, they lose their wings. They lose their bird bodies. They lose their complexity. They become more and more just another type of dangerous sea maiden. Just another fish-tailed woman who lures men to their doom. Just another kind of mermaid. Breathe slowly, in and out, as we watch this transformation unfold across centuries. It does not happen all at once. For a long time, throughout the early and middle medieval period, there is confusion, variation. Some artists still depict sirens with bird bodies. Some writers still describe them as the ancients did. The old knowledge has not completely faded. But alongside these traditional depictions, increasingly, there appear the new sirens. Fish-tailed, indistinguishable from mermaids except in name. And the meaning continues to shift. The sirens are no longer tests for heroes. They are no longer mysterious beings connected to death and forbidden knowledge. They are simply temptations. Specifically, sexual temptations. Women, or woman-like creatures, whose beauty and voices lead men astray. The misogyny in this interpretation is clear. The sirens, and increasingly the mermaids too, as the categories blur, become symbols of dangerous female sexuality. The threat that women pose to men's souls. The idea that beauty and desire are traps set by the devil. This is a far cry from the ancient understanding. The Greek sirens were not about sexual temptation. They offered knowledge, not pleasure. And the early mermaids were complex beings. Sometimes dangerous, yes, but also sometimes helpful, sometimes indifferent, as varied as the sea itself. But in medieval Christian allegory, such complexity is lost. The creatures are flattened, made into simple moral lessons. Rest now in the awareness of this change, this slow blending, this gradual loss of distinction. The boundary that once seemed so clear is cracking. Sirens are becoming fish-tailed. Their mythology is being simplified and moralized. They are losing their unique identity. And the mermaids, though we speak less of them in this period, are also changing. As sirens become more like mermaids in appearance, mermaids begin to inherit some of the sirens' darker reputation. They become more consistently dangerous, more associated with temptation and death. The two categories are bleeding into each other. Not yet fully merged, but the process has begun. It is slow. It will take centuries more to complete. But here, in the early Middle Ages, in texts like the Liber Monstrorum, in the allegorical interpretations of Christian scholars, here we can see the beginning. The first cracks in the boundary. The slow erosion of distinction. The gradual blending of two very different beings into one confused, amalgamated figure. Let yourself float now between these two worlds, the ancient clarity and the medieval confusion. Neither is wrong, exactly. Both are part of how these creatures live in human imagination. The bird women still exist, in older texts, in the memories of scholars who read Greek. The fish women still exist, in folklore, in coastal villages, in the stories sailors tell. But the space between them is narrowing. The boundary is thinning. And soon, though not yet, they will become almost indistinguishable. The sirens are losing their wings. The mermaids are inheriting a darker purpose. The slow blending has begun. Rest in this knowledge. Let the centuries flow. The transformation continues. Let us turn now to the books, the beautiful illuminated manuscripts that medieval monks created with such care. Books filled with animals real and imagined. Books that tried to catalogue all of God's creation, and all the monsters that lurked at its edges. These were called bestiaries, books of beasts. And they are where we can watch, page by page, image by image, the confusion between sirens and mermaids becoming visible, becoming permanent. Breathe slowly, and imagine yourself in a monastery library. The smell of parchment and ink, the quiet scratch of quills, the filtered light through narrow windows. A monk sits hunched over his work, copying an older text, adding illustrations in the margins. He is working on a bestiary, a sacred task. These books are not just catalogues, they are theological texts. Each animal, each creature, is meant to teach a moral lesson, to reveal something about God's creation and humanity's place within it. The monk comes to the entry on Sirens. He has his source text in front of him, an older bestiary, perhaps itself copied from another even older. The tradition goes back centuries, all the way to a text called the Physiologus. The Physiologus, the naturalist. It was written sometime around the 2nd to 4th century, somewhere in the Greek-speaking world, perhaps Alexandria. It described various animals and creatures, giving both natural details and spiritual interpretations. And it included sirens. Let yourself rest now in the knowledge of what this original Physiologus said about sirens. It described them as the ancients did, as creatures that were part woman and part bird. It spoke of their deadly song, their role in the story of Odysseus. It was faithful to the Greek tradition. But here is where the confusion deepens. Here is where the visual and the textual begin to diverge. As the Physiologus was copied and recopied, translated from Greek to Latin, passed from monastery to monastery across medieval Europe, scribes would add illustrations, pictures to accompany the text, visual representations of these creatures they were describing. And many of these scribes, perhaps most of them, had never seen the ancient Greek images of sirens. They had not seen the vase paintings showing bird women with wings and talons. They lived in a world where such images were rare, locked away in pagan ruins or lost entirely. But they had seen mermaids. Or rather, they had seen images of mermaids. Fish-tailed women appeared in church carvings, in marginal decorations, in other manuscripts. This was a familiar form. And so, when the scribe came to illustrate the siren entry, even though the text said bird-like, even though the words described wings and feathers, the scribe would paint a mermaid. A woman's torso, long flowing hair, a fish's tail curving beneath her, perhaps sitting on a rock, perhaps holding a mirror or comb, recognizably a mermaid in every detail, but labeled as a siren. Breathe deeply now, and feel the weight of this mismatch. Text and image telling different stories. Words preserving the old knowledge while pictures creating new knowledge. A confusion built into the very structure of these sacred books. One of the most famous examples is the Bern Physiologus, created in the 9th century, now preserved in the city of Bern, Switzerland. It is a beautiful manuscript, carefully made, richly illustrated, and when you turn to the page about sirens, there they are. 3 fish-tailed maidens, their bodies scaled and glistening, their tails curving elegantly. One plays what appears to be a horn or trumpet, another seems to be singing, the third accompanies on some kind of stringed instrument. They are clearly mermaids, unmistakably so. Any viewer would recognize them as fishwomen, creatures of the sea. And yet the text above them describes them in the old way, speaks of their bird-like nature, references the classical sources. The contradiction is stark, but it was copied anyway, and copied again, and again. Let your mind rest on this now, on the power of images. Words can preserve old knowledge, yes, but images shape understanding in immediate, visceral ways. A person might read the text and not quite comprehend what bird-like means, but they look at the illustration, and they see a mermaid, and that image lodges in their mind, becomes their understanding of what a siren is. The visual overrides the textual, and so the confusion spreads, not through deliberate choice, not through theological debate, but simply through the practical realities of medieval bookmaking. Scribes illustrating creatures they had never seen, using visual templates that were familiar to them. Centuries pass. The bestiaries continue to be copied. The tradition continues. By the 13th century, in England, scribes are still creating bestiaries that contain this same fundamental mismatch. One particularly fine example survives, an English bestiary with stunning illuminations. The siren entry is there. And once again, the pattern repeats. The text describes bird women, the classical story, the ancient understanding. But the illustration shows mermaids, beautiful fish-tailed women in the sea. At this point, the confusion is so deep, so entrenched, that perhaps the scribes don't even notice the contradiction. Perhaps they think the text is simply using poetic or archaic language. Perhaps they assume bird-like is metaphorical, referring to the quality of the sirens' voices, perhaps, rather than their bodies. Or perhaps they do notice, but they copy it anyway, because that is what the tradition demands. You copy what came before. You preserve what you received, even if it doesn't quite make sense. Let yourself sink into this understanding now, this recognition of how knowledge transforms over time, not through dramatic revolutions, but through small errors repeated, through misunderstandings that become permanent, through the slow erosion of clarity. The medieval world was not trying to confuse sirens and mermaids. Not deliberately, but the conditions were right for confusion. The ancient sources were distant, difficult to access. The visual culture of the time made mermaids familiar and bird women strange. The allegorical interpretations had already simplified the sirens' meaning. And so the bestiaries, these beautiful sacred books, became vessels of confusion. They preserved the old knowledge in text while replacing it with new knowledge in images. And most people, then as now, remember images better than words. A monk reading the bestiary might dutifully note that sirens are bird-like, but when he closes his eyes to imagine them, he sees the illustration. He sees the mermaid with her fish tail and her beautiful face. That is what his mind holds. And when he tells others about sirens, when he preaches a sermon using them as an example, he might describe them as fish-tailed sea maidens. Because that is what he remembers. That is what he has truly learned, despite what the words said. Rest now in this knowledge of how traditions shift, how meanings change, how the careful preservation of texts cannot always prevent the transformation of understanding. The bestiaries were meant to preserve knowledge, to pass it down through generations. And in some ways, they succeeded. We still have these texts. We can still read what they said about sirens. But they also transformed that knowledge. The illustrations replaced the text in people's minds. The visual confusion became the new reality. By the 13th century, when that English bestiary was made, hundreds of years after the Burn Physiologus, the pattern was set. Entrenched. Normal. Text says bird-like. Image shows fish-tailed. The contradiction is simply accepted. Expected. Part of the tradition itself. And with each copying, with each new bestiary created, the confusion deepened. The old understanding faded a little more. The merger of sirens and mermaids became a little more complete. The scribes bent over their work did not know they were participating in this transformation. They thought they were preserving tradition, maintaining knowledge, serving God through careful copying. But they were also changing the story, replacing bird women with fish women, making sirens into mermaids, one illustration at a time. Let the image settle now. Those beautiful manuscripts, gold leaf catching the light, careful Latin script, and in the margins, mermaids labeled as sirens. Fishtails where wings should be. The old knowledge preserved in words while being replaced in pictures. The confusion is now embedded in the holy books themselves. The transformation continues. The boundary grows thinner still. But the story is not quite so simple as text contradicting image. Not quite so clean as bird women becoming fish women overnight. Because in between, in the spaces where understanding was shifting, there appeared something strange. Something that reveals the confusion in the medieval mind. Hybrid images. Creatures that were neither fully the old sirens nor fully mermaids. Transitional forms. Experiments in trying to reconcile what could not quite be reconciled. Breathe slowly, and let yourself imagine the mind of a medieval artist. Perhaps a sculptor working on a cathedral, or an illuminator bent over a manuscript page. This artist has heard about sirens, has read the old descriptions, bird-like, the texts say, but has also seen the newer images, the fish-tailed maidens. Which is correct? Which is true? Perhaps both? Perhaps there is a way to combine them? And so the artist creates something new, something that has never existed before. A creature with a fish's tail, but also with wings. Scales glinting silver, but feathers sprouting from the back. A tail that curves like a mermaid's, but clawed feet protruding from where the tail should end. Bird and fish combined. Air and water merged into a single impossible form. These images exist. We have found them, carved into church columns, painted in manuscript margins, etched into the borders of maps. Creatures that are trying to be both things at once, that are caught between two understandings, two traditions, two ways of imagining what sirens are. Let yourself rest now in the strangeness of these hybrid forms. They are not beautiful in the conventional sense. They are unsettling, confused. They show us artists struggling with a problem they perhaps did not fully understand. How do you depict a creature when the sources contradict each other? When ancient text says one thing and newer tradition says another? When you must satisfy both the learned scholars who read Greek and the common people who know only the stories told in their own language? You compromise. You create hybrids. You add wings to the fish-tailed body. You give your mermaid the claws of a bird. You show her perched on a rock with a tail, yes, but also with feathers along her arms or sprouting from her shoulders. These are not successful images, in a way. They don't look quite right. They lack the coherence of either pure form, the elegant simplicity of the birdwoman, or the fluid grace of the mermaid. They are awkward, uncomfortable to look at, but they are honest. They show us the confusion, the uncertainty, the attempt to bridge two incompatible visions. Breathe deeply, and consider what these artists were doing, perhaps without fully realizing it. They were experimenting, trying to find a visual language for something that was changing in the culture, trying to give form to a creature whose very nature was in flux. And they were also exploring something else, something deeper, the visual representation of temptation and danger itself, because that is what both sirens and mermaids had become by this period. Symbols of temptation, warnings against desire. The medieval church was deeply concerned with sin, particularly sexual sin. And these creatures of the water and air, these beautiful women who lured men to their doom, they were perfect symbols for that concern. So the artists experimented. How do you make temptation visible? How do you show danger in a form that is attractive? The answer often was to mix beauty with horror, to create something that was alluring but also disturbing, something that drew the eye but also repelled it. A woman's face, beautiful, yes, inviting. But look closer. There are scales on her neck, claws instead of hands, wings that might be angelic or might be demonic, a tail that suggests both the sensual movement of a woman's body and the alien nature of a fish. These hybrid images play with this tension. They are meant to be uncomfortable, meant to make the viewer feel both attraction and revulsion, because that is what temptation is, in the medieval understanding. Something that appears beautiful but leads to damnation. Something that promises pleasure but delivers death. Let your mind drift now over the surfaces of old cathedrals, those great stone buildings where every carving has meaning, where nothing is merely decorative, where the stone itself is meant to teach, to warn, to guide the faithful toward salvation. And there, among the gargoyles and saints, among the biblical scenes and moral allegories, you might find her, a siren-mermaid hybrid, carved into a column capital or a corbel, fish-tailed but winged, beautiful but monstrous, singing her silent stone song. She is there as a warning. Stay away from temptation. Resist desire. The path of pleasure leads to hell. But she is also there as a spectacle. Something strange to contemplate. Something that sparks the imagination even as it cautions against imagining too much. The medieval mind was comfortable with paradox in a way that our modern minds often are not. These hybrid creatures, simultaneously bird and fish, angel and demon, beautiful and horrifying, they made sense in that context. They expressed truths that could not be captured in simpler forms. Temptation is contradictory. It appears as one thing but is another. It promises life but delivers death. It seems to offer freedom but brings enslavement. The hybrid sirens, with their wings and tails, their beauty and their monstrosity, embody this contradiction. They are visual paradoxes. Creatures that cannot exist but somehow do exist, at least in stone and paint and ink. Breathe slowly now, in and out, as we recognize these hybrids for what they are. Not mistakes, exactly. Not failures, but transitional forms. Stepping stones between one understanding and another. They could not last. They were too strange, too complicated. Eventually, the visual tradition would settle on one form or the other. Usually the mermaid form, the fishtail without wings, without claws. Cleaner, simpler, easier to carve and paint. But for a time, for decades or perhaps centuries, these hybrids existed. These impossible creatures that were both bird siren and fish mermaid. These experiments in depicting danger and desire. They show us artists thinking, working through a problem, trying to reconcile tradition with innovation, trying to honor both the old texts and the new understanding. And they show us the medieval imagination at work. That willingness to combine disparate elements, to create monstrous forms that somehow conveyed moral truths, to let the visual be strange and unsettling if that served the deeper purpose of instruction. Rest now in the knowledge of these hybrid forms, knowing that they existed even if they did not endure, knowing that the transformation from siren to mermaid was not instant, not clean, but messy and complicated and full of strange experiments. The artist's hand hesitates over the stone. Bird or fish? Wings or tail? Perhaps both? For a moment, at least. For this one carving, this one image. And then the chisel moves. The hybrid form emerges. Impossible but real. Transitional but permanent, at least in stone. A creature caught between two identities. Like the culture itself, caught between pagan past and Christian present. Between classical learning and medieval theology. Between the old stories and the new interpretations. The hybrid sirens swim and fly through that in-between space. Neither one thing nor the other. Both and neither. Experiments in giving form to confusion. Monuments to transformation itself. Let them fade now, back into the stone, back into the margins of old books, as the story continues forward. As the transformation continues. As eventually, inevitably, one form wins out. But remember they were there. Remember the wings on the fish-tailed body. Remember the claws protruding from the scales. Remember the confusion made visible. Remember the artists who tried to hold two contradictory truths at once, and carved them into stone that still stands today. Now we must turn to something less visible than images carved in stone, but perhaps even more powerful. We must turn to language itself. To words, to the simple act of translation, because this is where the merger becomes complete. This is where sirens and mermaids become, in the minds of most people, the same creature. Not through theological debate or artistic choice, but through the practical work of translators trying to render Latin texts into the languages people actually spoke. Breathe slowly, and let yourself drift into the world of medieval Europe. A world where educated people, monks, scholars, priests, read and wrote in Latin. But most people, the vast majority, spoke other languages. Old German, Middle English, Old French, Norse, dozens of regional tongues and dialects. And these common people wanted access to knowledge. They wanted to hear the stories. They wanted to understand what the learned texts said about the world and its wonders. So translators worked to bridge this gap, to take Latin texts and render them in the vernacular, the everyday language of common folk. And when they came to the word sirena, the Latin word for siren, they faced a choice. What word should they use in German? In English? In French? Let your mind rest now on the translator's dilemma. The Latin text says sirena. The translator knows this refers to creatures from ancient Greek myth. Creatures that sing and cause shipwrecks. Creatures that live in or near the sea. But what is the equivalent word in the translator's own language? What will the common people understand? There is no ancient German word for siren. No Old English term that carries all the same associations and meanings. The Greek myth is foreign, distant. But there are words for creatures that live in the water. For magical women with fish tails. For the beings that fishermen whisper about. For mermaids. In Old German, these creatures might be called Mermaids or Wasserwip, water women. In Middle English, they are mermaids, literally sea maids. In Old Norse, they are magiger. Different words in different languages, but all referring to the same basic concept. Fish-tailed women of the sea. And so the translator makes a choice. A practical, reasonable choice. When the Latin text says sirena, the vernacular translation says mermaid. It seems simple, innocent, just a translation decision. But the consequences are profound. Breathe deeply now, and consider what this means. A reader of the vernacular text, someone who cannot read Latin, who depends on translations, encounters a story about mermaids luring sailors to their deaths. About mermaids singing irresistible songs. About mermaids as symbols of temptation. That reader has no way of knowing that the original Latin said sirena. No way of knowing that the Greeks imagined these creatures with bird bodies, not fish tails. No way of knowing that there was ever a distinction between sirens and mermaids at all. To this reader, they are simply the same thing. Mermaids. Fish-tailed women. Dangerous creatures of the sea. The translation has collapsed the distinction entirely. What was once a blurred boundary has now vanished completely. And this happened everywhere. In glosses, those marginal notes in manuscripts that explain difficult words, we can see the equation being made explicit. A scribe writing in Old German encounters the Latin word sirena and writes in the margin, Mermaids, mermaid. The gloss treats them as simple synonyms, interchangeable terms for the same creature. In Middle English glosses, the same pattern appears. Sirena equals mermaid. No distinction. No explanation. Just equivalence. Let yourself imagine these glosses now. Those small notes in the margins, written in a different hand, perhaps, or in a different ink. They seem so minor. So unimportant. Just little helps for readers who might not know all the Latin vocabulary. But they are teaching something. They are creating an understanding. They are telling readers, definitively, these are the same thing. And once that understanding takes hold, once people believe that sirens and mermaids are simply two names for the same creature, it becomes almost impossible to undo. The knowledge is lost. The distinction is forgotten. By the late medieval period, in most of Europe, if you asked a common person about sirens, if they had heard the word at all, they would describe mermaids. Fish-tailed women. They might not even know that the Greek myths told a different story. That knowledge belonged to the learned few who could still read ancient Greek, and even many of them were confused by this point. Rest now in the understanding of language's power. Words shape thought. Translation creates reality. What cannot be named in a language becomes difficult to think about in that language. Old German and Middle English had no native tradition of bird women sirens. Those creatures did not exist in Germanic or Anglo-Saxon mythology. There was no vocabulary for them. No conceptual framework to hold them. But mermaids, water spirits, fish-tailed women, these existed in the native folklore. These made sense. These could be named and described and understood. And so sirens became mermaids. Not through deliberate choice. Not through any conspiracy or theological decision. But simply through the practical necessities of translation. Through the need to find words that common people would understand. The translators were not trying to erase the distinction between sirens and mermaids. They probably didn't even think about it in those terms. They were just trying to do their job. To make Latin texts accessible. To bridge the gap between learned and common culture. But in doing so, they completed a transformation that had been building for centuries. They took the confusion that already existed in visual culture, the bestiaries with their contradictory texts and images, and they made it linguistic. Made it structural. Made it fundamental to how people thought and spoke. Breathe slowly, in and out, as you recognize the inevitability of this change. Once the translations were made, once the glosses were written, once Sirena became mermaid in the vernacular texts, there was no going back. The common people of medieval Europe, the vast majority of the population, would never know sirens as bird women. That knowledge was lost to them. Lost to their culture. Lost to their language. They knew only mermaids. And when learned texts spoke of sirens, they understood those references as being about mermaids. Fish-tailed. Beautiful. Dangerous. Singers of deadly songs. The merger was complete. Not just in images. Not just in allegory. But in language itself. In the very words people use to describe and think about these creatures. And language, once it changes, is very hard to change back. Words carry their meanings forward. Children learn the words their parents teach them. Translators copy the glosses from older manuscripts. The equation becomes tradition. Becomes fact. Becomes the simple, obvious truth. Of course sirens are mermaids. Everyone knows that. It's what the words mean. Let this understanding settle now, gently, like snow falling on ancient texts. covering the old knowledge, making everything look the same. The Latin Sirena, with all its complex associations with Greek mythology, with bird women and forbidden knowledge and the underworld, becomes simply mermaid in German, in English, in French. And with that translation, centuries of distinction disappear. The boundary that was already cracking, already blurring, finally collapses completely. Language has changed everything. The sirens have lost their wings forever, at least in the minds of common people, at least in the vernacular understanding. They swim now with fish tales through German folk tales and English legends. They are mermaids in everything but their Latin name. And most people don't even know there was ever a difference. Rest now in this knowledge. Let the languages wash over you. Latin and German and English, all flowing together, blending, transforming meaning through the simple act of translation. The word siren remains in learned texts, but its meaning has changed, has been carried by translation into new territory, new understanding. The glosses in the margins tell us what we should think. And we think it, because that is what language does. It shapes the very possibility of thought. Sirens are mermaids. The equation is complete. The transformation is done. Let us travel now to England, to the 14th century, to a time when the English language itself was finding its voice. A time when one man, more than any other, would shape how English speakers understood their world and its stories. His name was Geoffrey Chaucer. Breathe slowly, and let yourself drift into medieval England. The 100 Years' War rages across the Channel. The Black Death has swept through, leaving villages empty. But life continues. And in the courts and cities, poets are writing, creating literature in English, not Latin, not French, but the language of common people, elevated to art. Chaucer was the greatest of these poets. He wrote of pilgrims traveling to Canterbury, of knights and their ladies, of merchants and millers and scholars. He drew on sources from across Europe, French romances, Italian poetry, Latin classics, and he translated them all into English. When Chaucer encountered the word Sirene in his Latin sources, those ancient creatures from Greek mythology, he faced the same choice that translators across Europe had been facing for centuries. What English word should he use? Let your mind rest on this moment. Chaucer sitting at his desk, perhaps in London, perhaps in the countryside. He has read widely. He knows his classics. He understands that the Sireni were important figures in ancient myth, that Odysseus encountered them, that they sang deadly songs. But his audience, the people who would read or hear his poetry, they were English speakers. Many of them could not read Latin. They needed a word they would understand, a word that would conjure an immediate image in their minds. And so Chaucer wrote, Mermaids, mermaids, sea maidens, fish-tailed women of the water. It was not a new translation. Others had made the same choice before him. But Chaucer was different. Chaucer was influential. His works were copied, read, recited, memorized. His word choices became authoritative. When Chaucer called them Mermaids, that is what they became in the English imagination. Breathe deeply now, and consider the power of a single translator's choice. Chaucer did not invent the confusion between sirens and mermaids. That confusion had been building for nearly 1,000 years by his time. But he crystallized it, made it permanent in English literature. After Chaucer, when English readers encountered stories about sirens, they automatically imagined mermaids. Fish-tailed, beautiful, dangerous. There was no moment of confusion, no need to puzzle out what these creatures were. The word itself told them. Mermaids. The image was immediate, clear. A woman with a fish's tail, sitting on a rock, combing her long hair, singing. That is what the word conjured. That is what readers saw in their minds. And this is crucial. This is where text and image finally, completely align. For centuries, there had been a mismatch. Bestiaries that described bird women but illustrated fish women. Glosses that equated sirens with mermaids, but texts that preserved the old Greek descriptions. A confusion between what was written and what was shown. But now, in the vernacular literature, in the works that common people actually read and heard, there was no more confusion. The text said mermaid. The reader imagined a mermaid. And when artists illustrated these texts, they drew mermaids. Everything matched. Everything made sense. The transformation was complete. Let yourself sink into this understanding now, like settling into deep water. The Sirens, as birdwomen, had become invisible to most of Europe. Not because anyone decided to erase them. Not because there was a conspiracy or a deliberate effort to change the myths. But simply because the language had changed. The translations had been made. And once made, they could not be unmade. Chaucer's readers, and the readers who came after him, the generations of English speakers who grew up reading English literature, they had no access to the original Greek understanding. Unless they studied classics. Unless they learned ancient Greek and read Homer in the original. And most people did not. Most people read in their own language. They knew the stories in their own words. And in English, sirens were mermaids. Mermaids. Rest now in the finality of this. By the time Chaucer was writing, by the late 14th century, the merger was essentially complete in vernacular culture. Oh, scholars still knew the difference. Priests who read Latin might still be aware that the classical sirens were described as bird-like. But this was specialized knowledge. Academic knowledge. In popular understanding, in the stories people told, in the images they created, in the words they used, sirens and mermaids had become one. When an English artist illustrated a scene with sirens, they drew mermaids. Fishtails, long hair, feminine beauty. No wings. No talons. No bird bodies. When an English poet wrote about sirens, they described mermaids. Sea-dwelling, fish-tailed creatures who sang from the water. When an English person heard the word siren, they thought mermaid. Text and image. Word and picture. Language and art. All aligned now. All telling the same story. All imagining the same form. The confusion that had plagued the bestiaries was gone. There was no longer a contradiction between description and illustration. Because the descriptions had changed. The language had absorbed the visual understanding. The words now matched the pictures. Breathe slowly, in and out, as we recognize what has been lost and what has been gained. What was lost? The ancient understanding. The bird women of Greek mythology. The creatures who represented forbidden knowledge, who were connected to death and the underworld, who played lyres and flutes on rocky cliffs. That specific, complex mythology, largely forgotten by common people. What was gained? Clarity. Simplicity. A unified image that everyone could understand. No more confusion. No more contradiction. Just mermaids, creatures of the sea, dangerous and beautiful, singing their songs. Is this a tragedy? A triumph? Perhaps both. Perhaps neither. It is simply what happened. It is how stories change. How myths evolve. How meanings shift across time and language and culture. The ancient Greeks would not recognize Chaucer's Mermaids as their sirens. They would see something different. Something new. A creature that had borrowed the siren's name and their song but had transformed into something else entirely. But Chaucer's readers did not know this. They had no way to know this. To them, sirens had always been mermaids. The word meant mermaid. The image was mermaid. There was no confusion because there was no memory of anything different. Let this understanding wash over you now, gentle as waves on a shore. Languages change. Words shift their meanings. What a word means in Latin is not necessarily what it means in English. Translation is transformation. Always. Chaucer took the Latin Sirene and gave his readers Mermaids. And in doing so, he completed a process that had begun centuries before. He brought text and image into alignment. He made the confusion resolve into clarity. The sirens, in English, were now permanently mermaids. The transformation was done. The alignment was complete. And from Chaucer's time forward, through the Renaissance and the Enlightenment and into our modern age, English speakers would continue to imagine sirens as mermaids, would continue to use the words almost interchangeably, would continue to see fishtails when they heard the word siren. The ancient distinction was gone, erased not by force, but by the gentle, inevitable process of linguistic change, by the practical decisions of translators, by the way words carry meanings forward through time. Rest now in this knowledge. Let the centuries flow past like a river. Chaucer writes his Mermaids. His readers imagine fish-tailed women. Artists draw what readers imagine. And the cycle continues, reinforcing itself, making the new understanding deeper and stronger with each generation. Text and image aligned at last. The sirens have become mermaids in everything but their name. And even the name, in English, in German, in French, even the name is being replaced. Why call them sirens when everyone knows they are mermaids? The transformation is complete. The alignment is final. The old distinctions rest now in ancient texts, waiting for scholars to rediscover them. But in the living language, in the stories people tell, in the images they create, sirens are mermaids. Mermaids are sirens. There is no difference. Not anymore. Something profound has happened now. Something more than just a change in appearance or a shift in language. The very meaning has transformed. The symbolism has moved from one creature to another, like a hermit crab finding a new shell. Breathe slowly, and let us explore what mermaids inherited when they absorbed the sirens. For remember, in the beginning, mermaids were not inherently deadly. They were not symbols of doom. They were complex beings, sometimes helpful, sometimes harmful, sometimes simply indifferent. They were the spirits of water itself, and water can give life or take it, can be gentle or violent, can sustain or destroy. But the sirens had always been about death, about temptation, about the fatal attraction of something beautiful and forbidden. And when sirens and mermaids merged, when they became one creature in popular imagination, the mermaids inherited this darkness. Let yourself drift now through this transformation, watching as the symbolism transfers, as meanings shift from bird women to fish women, as the deadly song finds a new singer. The siren song. That irresistible melody that promised knowledge and delivered death. That music so beautiful, so perfect, that sailors could not help but steer toward it, even knowing the danger. This song, this essential element of the siren myth, had to go somewhere. It could not simply disappear. It was too powerful, too central to the story. And so it transferred onto the mermaids. Mermaids began to sing. Not the gentle songs of the sea that some early tales described. Not the wordless melodies that accompanied their swimming. But the deadly song of the sirens. The irresistible call that lured sailors to their doom. In medieval and Renaissance art, we see this shift happening. Mermaids appear on rocks, just as sirens once did. They hold mirrors and combs, yes, those symbols of vanity and self-regard. But increasingly, they are also shown singing. Their mouths open, their heads tilted back, clearly vocalizing, clearly calling to someone beyond the frame of the image. And the implication is clear. This is not a casual song. This is the deadly call, the lure, the temptation. Breathe deeply now, and consider what else transferred along with the song. The sexual element, the association with temptation of the flesh, the idea that these creatures represented dangerous female sexuality. This was not part of the original siren mythology. The Greek sirens offered knowledge, not pleasure. They were not seductresses in the sexual sense. They were not about lust or desire. They were about the intellectual temptation of wanting to know everything. But medieval Christianity had changed that, had reinterpreted the sirens as symbols of sexual temptation, of worldly pleasure, of the sins of the flesh. And when mermaids absorbed the sirens, they absorbed this interpretation too. Mermaids became dangerous women, temptresses, beings whose beauty was a trap, whose songs promised pleasure but delivered death. The medieval and Renaissance imagination was deeply concerned with the dangers of female sexuality, with the idea that women, especially beautiful women, could lead men astray, could distract them from their duties, could endanger their immortal souls. And mermaids became perfect symbols for this fear. Let your mind rest now on the images that emerged. A mermaid on a rock, combing her long hair, beautiful, alluring, her naked torso exposed, her feminine curves emphasized, her fishtail both hiding and suggesting sexuality, neither fully revealing nor fully concealing. She sings, and a ship approaches, and the sailors, unable to resist, steer toward her. What happens next? In most tales, destruction. The ship runs aground. The sailors drown, or they are lured into the water, where they cannot breathe, where they cannot survive. Some stories suggest the mermaids take the sailors as lovers, drag them down to underwater kingdoms. But whether these sailors find happiness or death in the depths, the tales disagree. Most suggest death, or a fate worse than death, eternal captivity beneath the waves, forever separated from their human world. Rest now in the understanding of this transformation. Mermaids, who were once varied and complex, who could be helpful or harmful, kind or cruel, have become predominantly dangerous, predominantly associated with death and sexual temptation. The deadly allure. That phrase captures it perfectly. Allure. The attractiveness, the magnetic pull, the irresistible appeal. But deadly. Fatal. Leading inevitably to destruction. This is what mermaids inherited from sirens. This is what they became when the two creatures merged. And it changed mermaid stories forever. The helpful mermaids, the ones who saved drowning sailors, who warned of storms, who showed fishermen where to find abundant catches, these begin to fade from the stories. Or they become rare exceptions. Surprising anomalies in a pattern of danger. The default understanding of a mermaid, from the late medieval period onward, is of a creature to be feared, to be avoided, to be resisted. Sailors develop superstitions. Seeing a mermaid is an omen of shipwreck. Hearing a mermaid's song means death approaches. If a mermaid calls to you, you must not answer. You must not look. You must sail on, no matter how beautiful the song, no matter how powerful the temptation. Breathe slowly, in and out, as we recognize the loss in this transformation. The mermaids have gained the drama of the sirens, the literary power, the mythic weight. They are no longer just water spirits. They are symbols, representatives of timeless human concerns about desire and death, beauty and danger, attraction and destruction. But they have lost their complexity, their variety, their moral ambiguity. They are no longer individuals but types, no longer creatures with their own agency but symbols of human fears, particularly male fears about female sexuality. And the sirens themselves? What happened to them in this exchange? They lost their distinctive form, their bird bodies, their wings and talons, their connection to the air and to death and to forbidden knowledge. But their essence, their meaning, their symbolic power, this lived on. It transferred to the mermaids. It found a new form to inhabit. In a strange way, the sirens did not disappear. They transformed. They became mermaids, or rather, they made mermaids into something new. Something that carried forward the ancient Greek concerns about the dangers of curiosity and knowledge, filtered through medieval Christian concerns about sexuality and sin, and embodied in the form of fish-tailed women. Let this understanding settle now, like layers of sediment in still water. The symbolism has shifted. The song has transferred. The deadly allure now belongs to mermaids. And from this point forward, through the Renaissance, through the Age of Exploration, through the Romantic period and into our modern age, mermaids will carry this double inheritance. The ancient form from folklore and water spirit traditions, and the deadly meaning from the sirens. They will be beautiful and dangerous, alluring and fatal, singing songs that promise everything and deliver death. They will sit on rocks in the moonlight, combing their hair, calling to sailors who know better than to listen, but cannot help themselves. They will be the embodiment of temptation, the symbol of desire that leads to destruction. They will be what the sirens once were, just in a different shape. Rest now in this knowledge. The transformation is complete. The symbolism has fully shifted. Mermaids sing the deadly song now. They carry the allure. They represent the danger of beauty, the peril of desire, the fatal consequences of giving in to temptation. The sirens gave them this burden, or this gift, depending on how you see it. And mermaids have carried it ever since, swimming through our stories, singing their inherited song. Beautiful, deadly, forever changed by what they absorbed. The church was watching. The church was always watching. In the medieval world, the church shaped how people understood everything, from the movements of the stars to the nature of their own souls. And it certainly shaped how they understood stories. Breathe slowly, and let yourself enter the medieval Christian worldview. A world where everything has moral meaning, where every story, every image, every creature is either a lesson from God or a temptation from the devil. The church looked at mermaids and sirens, these beautiful women with their deadly songs, and saw perfect teaching tools, perfect warnings, perfect allegories for the spiritual dangers that threatened every Christian soul. And in using them this way, in making them both serve the same allegorical purpose, the Church strengthened the merger, made it not just linguistic, not just visual, but theological, moral, absolute. Let your mind drift now through the sermons and moral treatises of the late medieval period. Priests standing in pulpits, monks writing in their cells, all of them using the same examples, the same warnings, the same creatures. A priest might say, "Beware the mermaid song, my children," just as Odysseus had to resist the sirens. Notice how naturally the terms are mixed, how seamlessly one becomes the other. The mermaid song, the sirens of Odysseus, no distinction, no clarification needed. The congregation understands. They are the same thing. Or a moral treatise might warn, the siren sits upon her rock, combing her hair, displaying her naked beauty, singing sweetly to lure men to their doom. Just so does worldly pleasure call to us. Just so does sin present itself as beautiful and desirable, hiding its true nature, which is death. Notice the description. The rock, the combing, the naked beauty. These are mermaid attributes. But the text calls her a siren, and the moral lesson applies equally to both. Because in the Christian allegory, they serve the same function. Breathe deeply now, and understand what the Church was doing. It was not interested in mythological accuracy. It was not concerned with preserving the distinction between Greek sirens and folkloric mermaids. Such distinctions were irrelevant, perhaps even dangerous, distractions from the real purpose, which was moral instruction. What mattered was the lesson, the warning, the way these creatures could be used to teach Christians about the dangers of sin. And for that purpose, sirens and mermaids were identical. Both were beautiful women who lured men to destruction. Both sang deadly songs. Both represented the temptations of the flesh. Both symbolized how sin disguises itself as pleasure. So why maintain a distinction? Why confuse the faithful with details about bird bodies versus fish tails? Better to simplify, to merge, to create one clear image that everyone could understand and remember. The Church's allegorical use of these creatures was enormously influential. These were not just stories. These were moral teachings, delivered with all the authority of religious doctrine. When a priest said mermaids and sirens were the same, when a moral treatise used the names interchangeably, this carried weight. This shaped understanding. Let yourself rest now in the power of religious authority. In the medieval world, the Church defined truth. What the Church said was true became true, at least in the minds of believers. And almost everyone was a believer. If the Church said sirens and mermaids were the same dangerous temptresses, then that is what they were. No argument. No debate. The merger was not just accepted, it was sanctified, made holy by its use in religious teaching. And the allegory itself strengthened over time, became more elaborate, more detailed, more firmly established. Mermaid sirens became symbols of specifically sexual temptation, of lust, of the desires of the flesh that distracted men from their spiritual duties. This was spelled out in sermon after sermon, treatise after treatise. The naked female torso, whether rising from feathers or from scales, represented the display of feminine beauty, the temptation that women posed simply by being women. The song represented the seductive words, the flattery, the promises that lure men into sin. The water represented the depths of sin into which men fall when they give in to temptation. Drowning became a metaphor for damnation. The sailor steering toward the rocks became every man, every Christian soul, faced with temptation and the choice between resistance and destruction. It was a complete allegorical system. Neat, clear, powerful, and it required no distinction between sirens and mermaids. They were interchangeable parts in the same moral lesson. Breathe slowly, in and out, as we recognize what this meant. By the late Middle Ages, by the 14th and 15th centuries, the two beings were functionally interchangeable. You could use either name. You could describe either form. You could draw wings or tails. It didn't matter. Everyone understood you were talking about the same creature, the same warning, the same danger. A carving on a church wall might show a creature with a fish tail. The inscription might call it a siren. No one was confused. No one questioned it. It was simply accepted that these were two names for the same thing. A manuscript might describe the dangers of sirens and illustrate it with mermaids, or describe mermaids and reference the story of Odysseus. The mixing was complete, natural, expected. This was not sloppiness. This was not error. This was the new reality. The merger was so complete, so thoroughly accepted, that maintaining any distinction would have seemed pedantic, unnecessary, perhaps even strange. Rest now in the finality of this moment. The late Middle Ages represent the completion of a process that began nearly 1,000 years earlier. The first crack in the boundary has become a complete collapse. The two creatures are now one. Oh, scholars might still know the ancient Greek descriptions, might still be able to point to old texts that described sirens as bird women, but this was antiquarian knowledge, historical trivia. It had no bearing on current understanding. It did not shape how people actually thought about or depicted these creatures. In lived experience, in popular culture, in religious teaching, in art and literature and folklore, sirens and mermaids were the same. They were beautiful women with supernatural bodies who sang deadly songs and represented the dangers of sexual temptation and worldly pleasure. That was the consensus. That was the truth. That was reality. The Church had put its seal on this understanding, had used it in its most important work, the instruction of souls, the battle against sin, and in doing so, had made the merger not just complete but unquestionable. Let this settle now, like the final piece of a puzzle clicking into place. The transformation that began with a few confused texts in the early Middle Ages, that progressed through visual mismatches and linguistic translations, that deepened through symbolism and allegory, has now reached its conclusion. Sirens and mermaids are functionally interchangeable. The boundary between them has not just blurred. It has disappeared entirely. They are one creature now. One symbol. One warning. The Church has spoken. The culture has accepted. The merger is complete. And from this point forward, as we move out of the Middle Ages and into the Renaissance, as we approach the modern world, this understanding will persist. Sirens are mermaids. Mermaids are sirens. Two names for the same dangerous, beautiful, deadly creature. The distinction that the ancient Greeks knew so clearly is gone. Erased by time, by language, by culture, by religion, by the natural processes through which stories change and meanings shift. Rest now in this knowledge. The transformation is complete. The merger is absolute. The interchangeability is established. And it will remain so for centuries to come. Time moves forward now, sweeping us out of the Middle Ages and into something new. The Renaissance dawns. The printing press spreads knowledge faster than ever before. Explorers sail to distant shores. Science begins its slow challenge to religion's monopoly on truth. But the merger holds. In fact, it only grows stronger. Breathe slowly, and let yourself drift through the centuries. From the 14th century through the 15th, the 16th, the 17th. Through the age of Shakespeare and Cervantes. Through the Enlightenment. Into the 19th century of Romantic poets and Victorian moralists. And everywhere, in every country, in every language, in art and literature and popular culture, the same image appears. The singing mermaid. The fish-tailed siren. The beautiful woman who sits on rocks and lures sailors with her voice. This has become the standard. The default. The way everyone imagines these creatures. Let your mind rest on this now. This standardization. This is no longer confusion or transition. This is the new reality, fully established, completely normal, universally accepted. When an artist in Renaissance Italy paints a scene from mythology and includes sirens, they paint mermaids. Fish-tailed women with long flowing hair, sitting on rocks, often holding musical instruments or mirrors. No one questions this. No one says, but wait, shouldn't they have bird bodies? That knowledge has faded. When Shakespeare mentions sirens in his plays, his audience immediately pictures mermaids. When he writes of mermaid song and siren's voice in the same passages, using the terms interchangeably, everyone understands. No explanation needed. When Dutch painters of the Golden Age create elaborate maritime scenes, and include mermaids in the waters, These mermaids carry all the symbolism, all the danger, all the deadly allure that once belonged exclusively to sirens. The singing mermaid has become the default siren. The two are completely merged now. Not merging, merged. Past tense. Accomplished. Done. Breathe deeply now, and consider what happened to the bird women. Those original sirens. Those creatures with wings and talons that the ancient Greeks knew so well. They faded. Slowly. Quietly. Into the margins. They became scholarly footnotes. In universities, in libraries, in the studies of learned men who read Greek and Latin, there still existed knowledge of the ancient descriptions. Scholars who studied classical texts knew that Homer's sirens were not fish-tailed. They could point to ancient artwork showing bird women. But this was specialized knowledge. Academic knowledge. It existed in books that most people never read. It was discussed in languages that most people didn't speak. For the vast majority of people, for the culture at large, the bird women sirens were simply gone. Forgotten. Replaced so completely that most people had no idea they had ever existed. If you asked a common person in Renaissance Florence or Elizabethan London or Enlightenment Paris about sirens, they would describe mermaids. They would look at you strangely if you suggested anything else. Bird women? With wings and talons? What are you talking about? Sirens are fish-tailed. Everyone knows that. Let this reality settle into your awareness now, like dust settling after a long journey. The transformation is so complete that the original has been forgotten by all but a few scholars. And even those scholars, when they wrote their treatises, when they published their books, they were writing about the past. About ancient history. About what the Greeks once believed. They were not challenging the current understanding. They were not trying to bring back the bird women. They were simply recording for posterity that things had once been different. The bird women sirens had become historical curiosities. Museum pieces. Relics of a bygone age. Meanwhile, the mermaids thrived. They carried forward into the modern world, bearing their double inheritance. Beauty and danger. That is what they embodied now. That is what they meant. Rest now in this duality. This tension that makes mermaids so compelling, so endlessly fascinating to the human imagination. They are beautiful. Achingly, impossibly beautiful. Artists paint them with idealized feminine features. Long hair that flows like water. Graceful arms. Perfect faces. Their fishtails are rendered in shimmering scales, catching the light, almost jewelry-like in their decorative appeal. They are beauty incarnate. They represent the aesthetic ideal. The perfect woman, or at least, the perfect woman's form. But they are also dangerous. Deadly. Their beauty is a trap. Their songs lead to destruction. To encounter a mermaid is to court death. They sit on their rocks in the moonlight, and they are gorgeous, and they are doom. This duality becomes central to how mermaids are understood from the Renaissance forward. They are not one thing or the other. They are both at once. Beauty and danger, attraction and threat, desire and death, all wrapped together in a single form. Breathe slowly, and recognize how this makes them perfect symbols for the age. The Renaissance and the periods that followed were obsessed with duality, with the tension between appearance and reality, between surface beauty and hidden danger, between what tempts us and what destroys us. Mermaids expressed this perfectly. They looked like everything desirable, and they brought destruction. In paintings, they are rendered with loving attention to their beauty. Every curve of their bodies, every strand of their hair, every shimmer of their scales. Artists clearly delighted in depicting them, but the context often suggests danger. They appear in scenes of shipwrecks, near drowning sailors, in turbulent waters under stormy skies. The beauty is presented alongside the threat. In literature, the pattern continues. Poets write of mermaids' allure, their voices, their appearance, their seductive power, but also of their deadliness, of sailors who could not resist, of ships lured to their doom. The mermaid becomes a standard literary device, a way to talk about temptation, about the dangerous appeal of beauty, about how desire can lead us to destruction. Let your mind drift now over centuries of art and literature. So many mermaids, so many variations on the same theme. Each artist, each writer, adding their own interpretation. but all working within the same basic framework. Mermaids are beautiful women with fish tails who sing dangerous songs. That is the formula. That is the standard. That is what everyone agrees on. From the 14th century through the 19th, through tremendous cultural changes, through the Reformation and the Scientific Revolution and the Industrial Revolution, through all the upheavals that transform European society, this understanding of mermaids persists. It is one of the most stable elements in Western mythology. The standardized hybrid, the mermaid siren, fish-tailed, beautiful, dangerous, singing. And the bird women? They rest in old books, in classical dictionaries, in the notes of scholars explaining what the ancient Greeks meant when they wrote about sirens. But they do not live in popular imagination. They do not appear in new art or new stories. They are not part of living culture. They have faded, become footnotes, historical trivia. The mermaids have won. Or perhaps it's more accurate to say, the mermaids have absorbed the sirens so completely that the original form is no longer needed. The bird women can rest. Their essence has been preserved, just in a different body. Rest now in this understanding. By the 19th century, by the age of Romanticism and Victorian literature, the transformation is centuries old. It is simply the way things are. The way things have always been, as far as anyone knows. Mermaids are sirens. Sirens are mermaids, beautiful and dangerous, singing their deadly songs. The standardized hybrid, the new reality, the only reality most people know. Let the centuries wash over you like waves. The bird women are gone from living memory. The mermaids remain, carrying both their own ancient heritage and everything they inherited from the sirens. Beauty, danger, song, death, all wrapped in shimmering scales and flowing hair. The standardized hybrid swims through our stories still, unchanged now for hundreds of years. The transformation complete, the new form permanent. And then, something changes. Something new. Something unexpected. The 20th century arrives. And with it comes mass media, cinema, television, animation. Stories that reach not just hundreds or thousands, but millions. Stories that shape consciousness on a scale never before possible. And one of those stories, one particular story, will transform how an entire generation understands mermaids. Breathe slowly, and let yourself drift into 1989. A different world. A world where children grow up with movies instead of fairy tales. Where images move and speak and sing from screens. Where Disney reigns over childhood imagination. In that year, Disney releases The Little Mermaid. And everything changes. Let your mind rest on this film. This colorful, musical, animated story. The mermaid's name is Ariel. She has flowing red hair and a shimmering green tail. She lives in an underwater kingdom with her father and sisters. And she dreams, not of luring sailors to their deaths, but of becoming human. Of living on land. Of finding love. She is young, innocent, curious, brave, rebellious against her father's rules, yes, but not dangerous. Not deadly. Not a threat. She is a heroine. This is revolutionary. Breathe deeply and understand how radical this shift is. For centuries, for more than 1,000 years, mermaids had been warnings. Symbols of temptation and danger. Beautiful but deadly. Alluring but destructive. Objects of fear as much as fascination. But Ariel? Ariel is someone to identify with. To root for. To love. She has desires and dreams that the audience shares. She wants freedom. She wants to explore. She wants to fall in love. She wants to be understood. These are human longings. Universal longings. The audience, especially young girls, see themselves in her. And she gets a happy ending. She wins. She transforms, becomes human, marries her prince, lives happily ever after. No doom. No death. No destruction. The mermaid has been transformed from femme fatale to romantic heroine. Let this shift settle into your awareness now, like a fundamental change in temperature. The Little Mermaid was seen by millions of children. It became part of their foundational understanding of what mermaids are. For those children, now adults, Ariel is the default mermaid, not a dangerous seductress, not a warning against temptation, but a sympathetic character, a protagonist, someone with inner life and genuine emotions and worthy goals. Disney softened the figure, domesticated it, made it safe for children, made it aspirational rather than cautionary. And in the decades since, this understanding has spread. Countless books, shows, movies, and stories feature mermaids as protagonists, as heroes, as complex characters with agency and depth. Mermaids gained something in this transformation. They gained interiority, inner life, emotional depth. They are no longer just symbols, not just warnings, not just objects to be feared or desired. They are subjects. They have their own perspectives, their own struggles, their own stories to tell. Breathe slowly now, and consider what mermaids have become in modern storytelling. They have goals and motivations beyond luring sailors. They have families, friendships, cultures, entire civilizations beneath the waves. They have conflicts with each other, with humans, with their own desires and duties. They make choices. They grow. They change. They learn. They are, in short, characters, fully realized, three-dimensional, human in all the ways that matter, despite their fish tails. This is unprecedented in the long history of these creatures. Mermaids have never had this kind of depth before, this kind of agency, this kind of narrative complexity. But something interesting happens alongside this transformation. As mermaids become softer, more sympathetic, more heroic, the word siren begins to split away again. Not completely, not back to bird women, but split in tone, in connotation. Let your mind drift now through modern pop culture. Notice how the words are used. Mermaid suggests innocence, wonder, magic, romance, adventure. When a story features mermaids, they are often protagonists or at least sympathetic characters. They are Ariel's descendants, complex, emotional, capable of good and evil, but fundamentally, people. But siren? That word has kept its edge, its danger. In modern usage, a siren is still a femme fatale, still dangerous, still deadly. Call a woman a siren and you mean she is seductive, alluring, dangerous to men. You mean she uses her beauty and charm as weapons. The word carries all the old warnings, all the old symbolism. Beauty that destroys, pleasure that kills. Rest now in this interesting divergence. The creatures remain merged. Both words still refer to fish-tailed women, but the emotional weight has split. Mermaids can be good or bad, but they lean towards sympathetic. Sirens are dangerous. That is their defining trait. In television shows and movies, when sirens appear, they are often antagonists, villains, or at the very least, morally ambiguous, conflicted anti-heroes who struggle between their deadly nature and their desire to be something else. Some modern stories explore this conflict explicitly. A siren who doesn't want to kill, who fights against her nature, who tries to resist the compulsion to lure sailors to their doom. This gives sirens something they never had before: interiority. The struggle itself becomes the story, the internal conflict between what they are and what they want to be. Breathe deeply and recognize what modern storytelling has done. It has given both mermaids and sirens something revolutionary: psychological depth, agency, choice. These creatures are no longer just forces of nature. They are not just symbols or warnings or objects of fear and desire. They are characters with complex inner lives, with moral struggles, with the capacity to choose their own paths. A modern mermaid might choose to save a drowning sailor instead of letting him drown. And that choice means something. It says something about who she is as an individual. A modern siren might hear her own deadly song and hate it, might wish she could stop, might struggle against her nature. And that struggle makes her sympathetic, makes her interesting, makes her human, in the way that matters most. Let this transformation wash over you now, like warm water. We have traveled so far from the ancient Greeks, so far from medieval allegories. The mermaids and sirens of today are fundamentally different creatures from their ancestors. Not in form. They still have fish tails, still sing, still live in the water. But in meaning, in purpose, in narrative function, they are not warnings anymore. Or not just warnings. They are characters, protagonists, anti-heroes, villains sometimes, but villains with motivations and backstories and reasons for what they do. They have been humanized, given emotional complexity, made into mirrors for human experience despite their inhuman forms. Modern storytelling asks, what would it be like to be a mermaid? What would you want? What would you fear? How would you see the world? What choices would you make? These are questions that earlier eras never asked. Mermaids and sirens were not subjects. They were objects, symbols, tools for teaching moral lessons or expressing fears about female sexuality. But now they get to be people. Strange people. Magical people. People with tails instead of legs. But people nonetheless. Rest now in this understanding of how far we have come. From bird women singing of forbidden knowledge, to fish women as symbols of sexual temptation, to complex characters with emotional depth and moral agency. The journey has been long. The transformation profound. Ariel swims through our cultural waters now, alongside older, darker versions of these creatures. The romantic heroine and the femme fatale coexist. The innocent mermaid and the deadly siren share the same imaginative space. And modern audiences, we can hold both. We can understand mermaids as complex, as capable of good and evil, as individuals rather than types. This is the pop culture reinvention, the latest transformation in a story that has been transforming for thousands of years. The mermaids and sirens have been softened, complicated, deepened, humanized. They have gained what they never had before: emotional depth, agency, inner conflict, choice. And they swim forward into our futures, carrying all of this with them. Still beautiful, still strange, still magical. But now, finally, allowed to be more than just warnings or symbols. Allowed to be themselves. Whatever that might mean. This is not a mermaid in any European sense. This is a goddess of tremendous importance. The center of an entire cosmology. Breathe slowly now, and travel to Australia. To the traditions of Aboriginal peoples. To the waterholes and billabongs where spirits dwell. They are called Yok-Yok. Spirit beings who live in freshwater. They are sometimes depicted with fish tails, yes, but they transform. They can be women, or fish, or dragonflies. They are shapeshifters. Spirits of transformation and fertility and the life-giving power of water. They are not about danger or temptation. They are about the connection between humans and the natural world. About the spirit that animates water and makes it sacred. Let your mind drift to the Caribbean again. To the Taino people. To traditions that predate European colonization. She is Achaea. In the old stories, she was a human woman transformed into a water spirit. She can appear as a beautiful woman or disappear beneath the waves. She represents the connection between land and sea, between human and spirit worlds. And to Japan, to the Ningyo traditions, Sabuwalenu and other water spirits, beings that look superficially like mermaids, human above, fish below, but carry completely different meanings. They are omens, yes, but complex ones. Catching one might grant immortality or bring disaster. They are woven into folklore in ways that have nothing to do with European morality tales about sexual temptation. Rest now in the richness of these traditions. The diversity, the complexity. These are not variations on the European mermaid. They are not mermaids at all, really, except in the most superficial sense that they are water spirits that sometimes appear with human and aquatic features combined. But their meanings are entirely different. Their roles in their cultures are entirely different. The stories told about them serve entirely different purposes. Mami Wata is not about temptation. She is about power and prosperity and the relationship between devotees and divine spirits. Sedna is not a warning. She is a goddess who must be honored, a source of life itself for Arctic peoples. Yok-Yok are not deadly. They are spirits of transformation and fertility and the sacred nature of water. Achaea is not a symbol of sexual danger. She is about transformation and the liminal spaces between worlds. The Japanese Ningyo are not Christian moral lessons. They are woven into entirely different cultural frameworks, with different assumptions about the supernatural and its relationship to human life. Breathe deeply and understand what this means. The European mermaid siren is not universal. It never was. It is one tradition among many. One way of understanding water spirits among countless ways. For too long, European colonization and cultural dominance meant that the European understanding was treated as the understanding. The mermaid became the way to imagine water spirits. Other traditions were suppressed, dismissed, or simply ignored. But in our modern age, as voices from around the world gain platforms, as indigenous traditions are revitalized and honored, as African diaspora religions are practiced openly, as stories from non-European cultures reach global audiences, these other water spirits are emerging, claiming their place, challenging the idea that there is one universal mermaid. And this is important. This matters, because it reminds us that the story we have been following, the transformation of sirens into mermaids in European culture, is not the whole story. It is not even the most important story, except to European and European-descended peoples. It is one story among many. Let this understanding expand your awareness now, like ripples spreading across water. The world is full of water spirits, full of traditions, full of different ways of understanding the relationship between humans and the waters we depend on. Some look like mermaids. Some do not. Some are dangerous. Some are benevolent. Some are goddesses. Some are omens. Some are spirits to be honored. Some are forces of nature given form. The European mermaid siren, with all its history of transformation and merger, is just one thread in a much larger tapestry. And in our modern connected world, we can finally begin to see the whole tapestry, to honor the diversity, to learn from traditions beyond our own. The water spirits of the world are not all the same, and that is as it should be. Each tradition reflects the culture that created it. Each water spirit serves different purposes, carries different meanings, tells different truths about the relationship between humans and the waters that sustain and threaten us. Rest now in this expanded awareness. The sirens and mermaids of Europe have their story. But Mommy Water has hers. Sedna has hers. Yok have theirs. And countless other water spirits, some with names we know, some whose names are spoken only in languages we do not understand, all have their own stories, their own meanings, their own truths. The water is vast, and it holds more mysteries than any one tradition can contain. And now we arrive at our present moment, the 21st century, our time, when mermaids and sirens swim through waters both real and digital, when their images appear on screens and walls and skin, when their meanings continue to shift and multiply. Breathe slowly, and let yourself settle into the now, into this moment when ancient myths meet modern concerns, when creatures thousands of years old are reimagined for contemporary purposes. The mermaids of today are many things. They contain multitudes. And one of the most powerful modern transformations is this: mermaids have become symbols of environmental justice, guardians of the water, voices for the protection of oceans and rivers and lakes. Let your mind rest on this shift. From temptresses and warnings, to protectors, to environmentalists, it makes a certain sense. Mermaids live in the water. They are the water made flesh. They depend on healthy oceans for their survival. And our oceans are dying, polluted, overfished, warming, acidifying, filled with plastic that will remain for centuries. If mermaids were real, they would be the first victims of our environmental destruction. And so modern storytelling has embraced this connection. Mermaids appear in climate fiction, in environmental activism, in children's books about ocean conservation. They are recast as defenders of the sea, as beings who plead with humans to stop poisoning their homes. This gives mermaids a new moral dimension. They are not symbols of human sin anymore. They are victims of it. And they call on us to do better, to protect the waters, to act before it is too late. Breathe deeply now, and recognize how radical this transformation is. For more than 1,000 years, mermaids were warnings about dangerous female sexuality, about temptation, about the threats that women pose to men. But now they warn us about what we are doing to the planet, about the consequences of our greed and carelessness, about the destruction we are causing. The moral lesson has completely flipped. Mermaids are no longer the danger. We are. And this resonates. This speaks to modern audiences in ways the old moral lessons never could. We worry about climate change, about environmental collapse, about what world we are leaving for future generations. Mermaids as symbols of water protection tap into these very real, very contemporary fears and hopes. Let yourself drift now through modern visual culture, through art and film and photography, and notice something else that has emerged. The darkness has returned. The ambiguity, the gothic sensibility. Not all modern mermaids are Disney princesses. Not all are innocent and sweet and safe. There is a whole aesthetic movement of dark mermaids. Gothic mermaids. Mermaids that are beautiful but strange. Alluring but uncanny. Not quite human. Not quite safe. These mermaids have sharp teeth, hollow eyes, pale skin like drowned corpses, hair full of seaweed and bones. They look wild, feral, ancient, dangerous. They are not symbols of environmental protection. They are something older, something that connects back to the original power of these myths. The sense that the sea is not our friend, that it is alien, indifferent to human life, full of things we cannot understand or control. These dark mermaids are not villains, exactly. They are forces of nature. They are the sea's indifference made visible. They are what the ocean would be if it could take shape and look back at us. Rest now in the tension between these two modern visions. The environmental guardian and the gothic horror. Both exist simultaneously in contemporary culture. Both are valid interpretations. Both speak to real aspects of our relationship with water. We want the ocean to be beautiful, magical, a source of wonder. We want mermaids who will help us, who will remind us to protect what is precious. But we also know the ocean is dangerous, powerful beyond our control, capable of killing us without malice or mercy. And we want mermaids who embody that too, who remind us that nature is not safe, that beauty and danger are inseparable. Breathe slowly, and let your awareness expand to another aspect of modern mermaid culture. The commercialization, the merchandising, the transformation of mermaids into products. Walk into any store and you will find mermaids. On t-shirts and coffee mugs. On notebooks and jewelry. Mermaid blankets. Mermaid toys. Mermaid-themed parties. Mermaid tail swimming experiences at hotels and resorts. The mermaid has become a brand, an aesthetic, a lifestyle choice. There are mermaid performers now. Professional mermaids who swim in tanks at aquariums and restaurants, who pose for photographs at children's parties, who teach classes in wearing mermaid tails and swimming gracefully. Tourism industries have emerged around mermaid mythology. Towns claim to be mermaid capitals. Beaches offer mermaid experiences. Museums create mermaid exhibits. And perhaps most intimately, mermaids have become permanent art on human skin. Mermaid tattoos are everywhere, covering backs and arms and legs. Each one unique. Each one carrying personal meaning for the person who wears it. Let this commercialization wash over you. It might seem shallow, trivial, a degradation of ancient myths into consumer products. But it is also something else. It is proof of how deeply mermaids have embedded themselves in modern consciousness. They are not just characters in stories anymore. They are symbols people want to claim, to own, to incorporate into their identities. Someone who gets a mermaid tattoo is making a statement about themselves, about what they value, about how they see themselves in the world. The mermaid might represent freedom, or wildness, or femininity, or strength, or the ocean they love, or their own feeling of being caught between two worlds, or simply beauty, magic, the fantastical made permanent on their skin. Rest now in the multiplicity of modern mermaid meanings. They have become everything and nothing, universal and personal, commercial and sacred, silly and profound. You can buy mermaid-themed party supplies at a discount store. And you can read serious literary fiction exploring mermaid mythology with depth and nuance. Both exist. Neither invalidates the other. The fashion industry embraces mermaid aesthetics, iridescent fabrics that shimmer like scales, flowing designs that suggest underwater movement. Mermaid hair as a beauty trend, long wavy, often dyed in blues and greens and purples. People hold mermaid-themed weddings, dress as mermaids for festivals and conventions, create elaborate costumes and share them online. Communities form around shared love of mermaid imagery and mythology. This is something new in the long history of these creatures. They have become participatory. You do not just hear stories about mermaids. You can become one. Put on a tail. Swim like a mermaid. Dress like one. Embody the aesthetic. Claim the identity, at least temporarily. Breathe deeply, and recognize what this means. Mermaids have become so familiar, so integrated into popular culture, that they are no longer distant mythological beings. They are accessible, aspirational, something anyone can engage with. This has softened them further, made them safe, commercial, but it has also kept them alive, kept them relevant, kept them swimming through our cultural waters. And alongside all this commercialization, the serious reinterpretations continue. The environmental symbolism, the Gothic revivals, the literary explorations, the cultural reclamations by indigenous peoples whose water spirit traditions were suppressed. The mermaids contain all of this now. All these contradictory impulses and meanings and uses. They are environmental symbols and consumer products. Gothic horrors and Disney princesses. Ancient goddesses and modern fashion statements. Warnings about pollution and cute decorations for children's rooms. They are whatever we need them to be. Whatever we make them. And perhaps this is fitting. Perhaps this is what creatures of myth are supposed to do. To transform, to adapt, to absorb new meanings while carrying echoes of the old, to be flexible enough to survive across millennia and cultures and dramatic shifts in human understanding. Let yourself float now in this recognition. The mermaids of today are not less than the mermaids of the past. They are not degraded by commercialization or simplified by Disney or trivialized by merchandise. They are more. They contain more meanings. They serve more purposes. They live in more places, not just in stories, but on screens and walls and skin and souvenirs. They have spread, multiplied, diversified. They are environmental guardians. They are Gothic horrors. They are fashion trends. They are tattoos. They are tourist attractions. They are all of this and more. And they continue to evolve. The transformation never ends. The story continues. The mermaids swim on, through waters both literal and metaphorical, carrying with them thousands of years of accumulated meaning and the promise of new meanings yet to come. And so we reach the end of our journey, the end of this long swim through time and myth and meaning, from ancient Greece to this present moment, from bird women on rocky cliffs to fish-tailed women on smartphone screens. Breathe slowly, deeply, and let yourself rest in all that we have discovered. We began with a distinction. Sirens and mermaids were not the same. They were different beings, different forms, different meanings. The ancient world knew this clearly. And then slowly, over centuries, that distinction blurred, cracked, dissolved. Through translation and allegory. Through visual confusion and linguistic change. Through the practical decisions of monks copying manuscripts and priests delivering sermons and poets choosing words. The two became one. The boundary disappeared. By the late Middle Ages, they were functionally interchangeable. By the Renaissance, the merger was complete. The bird women had vanished into scholarly footnotes, and the fish-tailed women had inherited everything. The deadly song, the dangerous allure, the symbolic weight of temptation and doom. And then, in our modern age, they transformed again, softened into romantic heroines, deepened into complex characters with agency and inner life, diversified as voices from around the world added their own water spirit traditions to the conversation, reimagined as environmental guardians and Gothic horrors and commercial products and personal identity markers. The transformation never stopped. The story never ended. It continues still. But let yourself rest now on a deeper truth. A recognition that has been building throughout our entire journey. Mermaids and sirens. These creatures we have been following through time. They are not just creatures. They are mirrors. Let that understanding settle into you now, like moonlight settling on dark water. Mirrors, reflecting us, reflecting humanity, reflecting whatever culture looks into them. The ancient Greeks saw forbidden knowledge. They saw the danger of curiosity. They saw the boundaries between mortal and divine, between what humans should know and what should remain hidden. They created birdwomen who embodied these concerns, who gave form to their fears about hubris and the consequences of reaching too far. Medieval Christians saw sexual temptation. They saw the dangers of the flesh. They saw women as potential threats to men's salvation. They transformed the creatures to reflect these fears, made them symbols of sin, warnings against desire. Renaissance artists saw the tension between beauty and danger, between appearance and reality. They painted mermaids who embodied this duality, who were gorgeous and deadly at once. Romantic poets saw the wild and the untamed, the natural world as something powerful and indifferent to human concerns. They wrote of mermaids as forces of nature, beautiful but inhuman. Victorian moralists saw what they always saw: warnings, propriety, the need to control and contain anything that might threaten social order. Modern storytellers see so many things: environmental crisis, female empowerment, queer identity, body positivity, cultural reclamation, personal transformation, the complexity of beauty and the right to agency. Breathe deeply now and understand what this means. The creatures change because we change. They reflect what we fear, what we desire, what we value, what we struggle with. When we were afraid of knowledge, mermaid sirens sang of everything we wanted to know. When we were afraid of sexuality, they became symbols of sexual danger. When we struggled with the tension between nature and civilization, they embodied wildness. When we began to value female agency and complexity, they gained interiority and choice. When we became aware of environmental destruction, they became guardians of the water. The creatures themselves, if they exist at all, are unknowable. We cannot ask a real mermaid what she means, what she represents, what truth she embodies. So we project. We see in them what we need to see, what we fear to see, what we hope to see. They are mirrors. And like all mirrors, they show us ourselves. Let yourself float now in this recognition. This is not a weakness of mythology. This is its strength. This is why myths survive, why they matter, why they continue to be told and retold across thousands of years. Because they are flexible, because they adapt, because they can hold whatever meanings we pour into them. The mermaid siren is not one thing. She has never been one thing. She is countless things, layered meanings, accumulated symbolism, centuries of projection and interpretation and reimagining. She is temptation and innocence, danger and protection, victim and villain, monster and maiden, symbol and character, warning and aspiration. She is whatever we need her to be in this moment. And in the next moment, she will be something else. Rest now in the understanding of power. These creatures have power, not because they are real, but because we make them real. We give them life through our stories, through our art, through our fears and desires, through our constant reimagining. They have power over us because we grant them that power, because we continue to be fascinated, to be drawn to them, to see something in them that speaks to something in us. The mermaid on the rock, combing her hair, singing. She has appeared in countless forms across countless cultures, and she will appear in countless more, because we are not done with her. We are not done seeing ourselves in her. She reflects our changing relationship with water, with the ocean, with the natural world. As that relationship changes, as we move from seeing the ocean as an infinite resource to recognizing it as a fragile ecosystem, the mermaid changes too. She becomes environmental guardian, victim of our pollution, voice for conservation. She reflects our changing understanding of gender and sexuality and power. As those understandings evolve, as we question old assumptions and create new possibilities, the mermaid evolves too. She gains agency, complexity, the right to her own story. She reflects our cultural anxieties and aspirations, our fears about beauty and aging, our desires for transformation and escape, our sense of being caught between worlds, our longing for magic in a disenchanted age. Breathe slowly, and let this all wash over you like gentle waves. The sirens and mermaids are mirrors. They show us who we are, who we fear we are, who we hope to become. And the reflection changes, because we change, because culture changes, because the concerns of one age are not the concerns of another. The ancient Greeks could not have imagined Disney's Ariel. Medieval monks could not have conceived of mermaids as environmental activists. And we cannot imagine what mermaids will mean 1,000 years from now, what new meanings future cultures will pour into these ancient forms. But the creatures will persist. They will adapt. They will transform again and again. They will continue to be mirrors, reflecting whatever looks into them. This is the true story. Not the story of how bird women became fish women. Not the story of linguistic confusion or artistic misinterpretation. The true story is this: humanity needs myths, needs creatures that can carry meanings, needs forms flexible enough to adapt across time and culture, needs mirrors in which to see itself. And mermaids and sirens, in all their forms, in all their variations, in all their contradictions, serve this need perfectly. They swim through our collective imagination, through our stories and our dreams, through our fears and our longings. They have been with us for thousands of years, and they will be with us for thousands more, changing, adapting, reflecting, always showing us ourselves, beautiful, dangerous, complex, human, even when they wear tails instead of legs, even when they swim instead of walk. They are us. We are them. The mirror works both ways. Rest now. Let the reflection settle. Let the waters grow calm. The sirens are silent now. The mermaids sleep in their depths. And you have traveled far. Through time, through myth, through meaning. And perhaps you have seen yourself reflected too. In the bird women singing of forbidden knowledge. In the fish women combing their hair. In the deadly allure. The environmental guardian, the gothic horror, the romantic heroine. In all the forms these creatures have taken, in all the meanings they have carried, perhaps you have found something that speaks to you, some aspect of the myth that resonates, that reflects your own fears or desires or struggles or hopes. If so, then the mirror has done its work. The creatures have served their purpose, and they will continue, as long as humans tell stories. As long as we need myths to help us understand ourselves, the mermaids and sirens will swim on, through our waters, through our dreams, reflecting us, always reflecting us, forever.